Hello, and thank you for listening to Mapping the Zone, podcast dedicated to informal discussion on the works and context of Thomas Pynchon. I'm one of the co-hosts, and my name is Kate.
I'm Luke.
And I'm Will.
And this week we're going to be discussing pages 57 through 80 of Against the Day, which is essentially just chapter 7 of Against the Day, sort of a short story in the life of one of the characters we've already been introduced to. Luke, you said you had a summary for us?
Yeah, I do. So I'll just get into it. First, we backtrack, descending into Merle Rideout's subconscious. Merle is dreaming of a museum, but ultimately, Merle is dreaming of Erlis, the mother of his charge, Dally. Next, Merle reads about an experiment that's about to happen over in Cleveland. The experiment concerns whether or not the Earth's movement affects the speed of light moving through the ether. But before Merle journeys over to Ohio, where it seems he is fated to first meet Erlis, he visits our old friend and friend of the pod, Professor Vanderjuice. They discuss the ether like two monks talking over the finer points of some alien religion. Merle finally arrives in the forest city, only to discover a heavy police presence. There's too many etherists in town, and the local madhouse is overflowing. Cleveland, what a lively town, what a happening place. The craziness of the etherists begins to infect even Merle himself. Where once he was pragmatic and logical, he finds himself descending, like so many other etherists, into crackpot theories. The other experiment reaches its end, and the results disappoint the etherists. The ether, if it even exists, doesn't affect the speed of light. The religious implications of the experiment are explored next, and then Merle takes advantage of a fire at the insane asylum to break out a friend named Roswell. To repay Merle for his kindness, Roswell teaches Merle the mystical art of developing photography. Soon, Merle has a new hobby, no, a new calling. Previously ignored in this summary, the tale of Blinky Morgan comes to an end as the infamous outlaw is executed for his crimes in good old Columbus, Ohio, otherwise known apparently as the asshole of America. At loose ends, Merle finally meets Erlis, though the details of their courtship and Dally's conception are left up to the reader's imagination. We skip forward to the day when Luca Zombini, a magician, spots Merle's wagon and approaches him in search of a magnetic coil to use in his act. Zombini offers Erlis a role in his magic show, and that's all she wrote. Erlis runs off with Zombini, leaving Merle to raise Dally all on his own. Then we jump forward again to just after the World's Fair, as Merle and Dally repeatedly encounter refugees from the fair, either journeying home or attempting to settle in America. Merle begins supplementing his income by foraging for various plants as the father and daughter pair journey through the American heartland, where Merle repeatedly finds new women to fall in love with, seemingly everywhere he looks. Time passes, Dally grows up, and photography technology advances. Merle often finds work as a bell hanger and general handyman, and even for a summer, finding a job as a lightning rod salesman, which causes him to encounter Skip, a sentient bit of ball lightning, who soon becomes Dally's playmate and pseudo-sibling. Speaking of siblings, Dally and Merle gradually move deeper into the West, and one day in Denver, Merle comes across a magazine article that explains what became of Erlis and Zombini. They settled in the state of New York and now have, quote, will look like a dozen or so kids, end quote. Merle plans to hide this discovery from Dally, but Dally, of course, immediately finds out. She is, quote, a sport about the whole thing, end quote, though. In Colorado, Dally and Merle settle for a time on an abandoned farmstead. There, Merle returns to devoting himself to photography, and one day, drawn by the smell of nitro, Webb Traverse appears. Merle and Webb talk over the finer points of alchemy, and Webb informs Merle of an opportunity for steady work in the mines near Telluride. Merle seizes the opportunity, and him and Dally settle for a couple years in the mountains of Colorado.
All right. So for this week, Cody is unfortunately indisposed at a family event, so it'll just be the three of us. But that being said, looking over these pages, what did we think? What were our general thoughts?
I really liked it. I love this book in general, so I'm gonna say that I like every section, every episode probably. But
Sure.
there's a lot to love here. All the stuff with the Etherists and stuff is really well done. I think it's just kind of fun. There's some, I do think we get some clues as to why Erlis left Merle, which we'll get to, I'm sure. With that whole mystery of why she ran off is kind of fun to think about and speculate about. It ends in Colorado in the mountains of Colorado, which, as I've already talked about, is I grew up on the Front Range, which is not exactly the mountains, but it's close by. So I really love that part. Skip is a very likable character. He's obviously somewhat reminiscent of Byron the Bulb. And yeah, I don't the research that Pynchon did into photography is kind of fun to think about, given the fact that there's only a few known pictures of him. I was reading, I think it was this week or maybe last week, about the Pynchon archive, or Pynchon giving his papers to an archive, and it was mentioned in the article about it that there were no photographs included in that archive. Which, from my own work with archives in grad school and after grad school, I'm not sure about Cormac McCarthy, but I know like people like Sandra Cisneros have a lot of pictures in their archival material. So I think it's pretty typical for there to be at least some pictures. And it's just kind of funny and fun to think about Pynchon doing all this research into something that he ostensibly, I don't know, maybe the man likes taking pictures. He just doesn't like being in pictures or something, but that whole thing's fun to think about. And as always, just some really fun prose, really good prose in this section. Something I talked about in Vineland a little bit is Pynchon's depiction of Middle America, and I do like that this section is more focused on kind of the Midwest and a little bit of the West and stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot to like. There is part of me, Luke, in reference to your comments about Pynchon on cameras, that makes me wonder if perhaps if you managed to find him and offer to take like a wet plate photo of him, he'd be all about it. Maybe the reason why he hates photos is because it's all digital cameras now, and he clearly despises the direction that camera technology took. But I mean, this was a surprising section. One, because it's sort of like kind of like I said at the beginning of the episode, like it reads almost as kind of a complete short story about this guy's kind of journey from one end to the other of a section of this country, and of his relationship with his daughter as his daughter grows up through childhood and then eventually to at least teenager, if not young adulthood. It also advances the timeline of the novel pretty significantly. Some of the camera inventions that are referenced here don't show up until 10 years after 1893. They show up in 1903, specifically like one of the types of, what do you call it, like camera film that he makes a reference to, and then like the Kodak Brownie. So there's a lot to like in here. There's a lot of really great prose, a lot of like Pynchon poetry that we talk about a lot as far as it relates to sort of writing about the land or the nature setting of the country, especially at that time. And it was also a case where like I wasn't expecting to cry while reading these pages, but I did when he does get to that moment where camera technology takes a step forward and kind of the alchemy gets lost out of it. Like, I was surprised to find myself tearing up a little bit. I wasn't, weeping or anything like that, but there had been enough of a difference in the descriptive element that Pynchon uses between the initial sort of learning phase and now where it was at, and everything with his daughter being mixed up in that it did put me in a brief little moment of a couple of tears. And there's a lot of stuff in here that seems referential to Vineland, specifically the relationship between Earl and Dally, and then some of the ideas present in Mason and Dixon certainly show up in here. It's a really great sort of this chapter with a lot of excellent elements, and yeah, I don't want to get really too deep into the weeds on anything before we actually start going over the material properly.
Yeah, as far as my take, I was gonna say that I like that this is as almost 60 pages into the book. Finally, there's some grounding to things. Not that there isn't some reality in the previous chapters, but there's so much jumping between different modes of genre and scope of discourse and focus on which characters, that just to have the focus be on Merle and how he feels about things and how things around him are changing is a needed break
Hmm.
And I think the way that you compared this section to moments or a lot of scenes in Vineland and Mason and Dixon is exactly what that is. It is just this almost a throwback kind of thing that Pynchon did in those books, in terms of how he structures his narrative that dominates this chapter, and it's just very satisfying after so much vertigo in the previous ones.
Yeah.
Because I didn't quite tear up at any of the emotional moments, but I mean, just the scenery and the way that it works is just so gripping, even if it didn't bring me to that brink.
Yeah, absolutely. Some really, really excellent nature writing. Moving forward, do we want to establish how we want to pronounce Aether for the first half of this podcast?
Yeah.
Given that it's going to come up a lot.
I think Cody pronounced it Ether, and that's how I was
Ether.
following his lead. But I don't. I could be Aether. I think I used to pronounce it Aether until I heard Cody say it. I don't really know.
I personally don't think it matters all that much. I think it's valuable for the listeners of our show to be reminded that we are talking about a book and pronunciation is different from writing.
Sure.
But if we're gonna choose, I do go towards Aether.
Where this picks up is we are opened to a dream that Merle Rideout is having, where he is present, quote, in a great museum, a composite of all possible music, statues, pictures, crockery, folk amulets, antiquated machinery, stuffed birds and animals, obsolete musical instruments, and whole corridors of stuff he would not get to see. He was there with a small party of people he didn't know, but in the dream was supposed to know. Abruptly, in front of a display of Japanese weapons, an official person in ragged plainclothes, unshaven, mistrusting, and bitterly humorless, who may or may not have been a museum guard, grabbed hold of him on suspicion of having stolen some small art object and demanded that he empty out his pocket, including a bulging and dilapidated old cowhide wallet, which the guard indicated was to be emptied too. The crowd had gathered around, including the familiar, unfamiliar group he'd come here with, all silently staring. The wallet itself was a sort of museum, a smaller scale, a museum of his life, overstuffed with old ticket stubs, receipts, notes to himself, names and addresses are half, and sometimes totally remembered folks, forgotten folks, from his past. In the midst of all this biographical litter, a miniature portrait of her appeared. He woke up, understanding at once that the whole purpose of the dream was to remind him, with diabolical roundaboutness, of Erlith Mill. And so that really sort of perfectly sets up the tone of what the following, 23 pages is going to be. This is a short story, essentially, about a man and his essentially ex-wife, even though they don't seem to have ever been officially divorced, and the relationship that he has with his daughter after that. And I do sort of love the descriptive elements here, especially in relation to his wallet being a museum of his life beforehand. It's just absolutely wonderful writing that perfectly kind of sets the tone for what we're about to read. And so from there, it kind of moves backwards in time to the Michelson-Morley experiment. I did some research on it, but I am passingly interested in science, but can have a difficult time kind of breaking down how some of this stuff is referred to. Does someone want to explain what the Michelson-Morley experiment is? Did any of you guys do like a good amount of research on this, or have an understanding of it beyond what I might have?
I feel like I get it, but I don't. I certainly don't understand it if the bar is being able to teach it to a 5-year-old. But what I'll say is that it is, or whenever anyone is trying to learn about like these kinds of experiments, it never really quite makes sense because of the fact that like this was essentially a metaphysical experiment conducted like 100 and almost 150 years ago now. But I do feel like the Wikipedia page is a generally cogent explanation, and I think that
Yeah.
if you have a baseline understanding of physics, and you spend the time it takes to understand, anyone who's listening who is at a loss can understand it themselves. But what I guess, to give the very small explanation, it basically that if aether is the medium through which light and most other things sit, and aether is a fluid, then it would follow that there is a momentum, because otherwise waves could not propagate within it. And so they constructed these specific forms of like light interferometers to try and track any kind of momentum within that fluid that would be the substrate for light to pass through. And beyond that, I think that the discussion in the book actually kind of gets the implications of that covered. You know, they didn't find evidence for or against momentum in the fluid. So if the fluid is there, it is effectively not a fluid, and so you either need to dispose of the idea from a scientific framework or go all the way to the Hindu Brahman interpretation, I guess.
I can't say I'm familiar with that interpretation of it. Do you want to give an overview of what that might be?
Oh, well, to maybe put it in terms that you're more familiar with, the Spinozan idea of God.
Oh, sure. Okay.
Yeah, so you know, either there is no fluid in a real sense, or in a real sense, everything is subsumed in the fluid.
Yeah, I do have in my notes later on when they're talking about kind of what the implications of that might be. There seems to be a reference to what could also be like the Aristotelian proof of God, like the concept of an unmoved mover. That is where like all of the things interacting with one another got set off back from. Yeah, so we find that Merle is in Cleveland when this experiment is sort of set to run out, and as a result of that, there's this entire sort of mass group of aetherists running about, it, in both in the insane asylum in Cleveland, but also outside of it, getting ready for kind of the final proof that may come for the belief system they have, and for the at times seemingly religious belief in the aether that they have. There's a lot of very interesting details that you can go through to kind of track the history of how this belief system kind of got started from a scientific perspective. I couldn't find anything that pointed towards aetherists the way that they're depicted in the book, certainly. But I think that what Pynchon is really more doing is kind of pointing to sort of old understandings of science or technology as being somewhat mystical or religious in nature, similar to photography and alchemy that he eventually kind of points to. There is also a couple of different references that do come up within the Pynchon wiki about sort of aetherists maybe being somewhat inspired by I think they were called breatharians, is I guess the name of people that believed you could live without food and that you could only sort of live off of your own breath. He calls them lightitarians in this book, and they're kind of a division of the aetherists. Do we have any additional thoughts on what Pynchon might be using this group of kind of, I guess, devotees of an outmoded means of defining light and how it travels within the book? What did we think he's up to by talking about this particular piece of history and starting his character off here?
To me, it seems more to be a discussion about the process of science and philosophy, not philosophy with a capital P or science with a capital S, but the way that we orient ourselves in the world, the way that we conceive of the world around us, is something which you do divvy up, and you must divvy up on some level. You must create a model and a framework to understand where you are in the universe and the world around you. At the same time, it seems like the thrust is that the closer you get to any particular surface of the real world, the more divisions will appear, at least in terms of how you want to define things. At this point, I think when people talk about aether in non like esoteric occultic settings or in non-historical context, when it comes up in a science class, it's going to be coming up from the Einstein quote, where he basically says that his ideas of general and special relativity would not have been accepted without the kinds of metaphysical cosmological experiments like Michelson Morley. And I think that's a good way to situate this conversation. When you really break down the implications of general and special relativity, it kind of makes the whole question of whether or not there is an aether feel redundant.
Mhm.
But that is the kind of thing that you only come to, 30 years after you conduct an experiment like Michelson Morley.
I do think that there's also an element of Pynchon kind of trying to point out the interplay, especially before modern times, before maybe before the 1900s, the connection between the relationship between mysticism and physics. Where I remember a few years ago, I had a conversation with this guy who was majoring in physics. When I mentioned something related to that there's a historical relationship between mysticism and physics. And he seemed pretty confused by that. I think because, he was probably not, I don't think that aspect of it is probably emphasized in modern physics classes. But there is kind of an element of, these people believe in the aether so much that it's like they're like creating like a cult around it or something. And I do think that he is kind of trying to point out the relationship between like religion and science, and how they used to be kind of more maybe not connected, but they used to kind of play with play off of each other more, which I think comes up some in Gravity's Rainbow. I want to say the connection between science and religion and kind of how they're opposed, but they also have things in common.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's truth certainly in both of those interpretations of the equation, or rather, like the both of those are reasons why we get set here. I think the other thing too is that he gets an opportunity to put part of his setting in Ohio. I know that one of the writers on the Pynchon wiki mentions that it's pretty strange that he spends so much time in Ohio. Specifically says Pynchon spends an inordinate amount of time in Ohio and against the day. Why? I don't know. And then proceeds to bring up the idea that potentially it's because of the domination of politics from 1869 to 1923. I think the actual answer to potentially why this is the case is actually on page 59, where it mentions Merle had an eerie sense of not having left Connecticut. Same plain gable front houses, white congregational church steeples, even stone fences. More Connecticut, just shifted west was all. This is a reference to the Western Reserve of Connecticut, which is something that if I probably spent too much time researching, because it then kind of spiders out to like a historical understanding of the Northwest Territory, and then sort of the political implications of what that was. And I think that's really where Pynchon is kind of coming from with choosing this setting. And he's lucky enough that he has this sort of major kind of intersection of technological and scientific advancement, but also the religious and mystic elements sort of coming up as a staging ground to introduce Merle to photography, and then kind of take the sections for the rest of this chapter, in the direction that he wants to go in. I'm going to do my best to kind of summarize some of this information. This line, as I mentioned, is a reference to the Connecticut Western Reserve, and this is a piece of land in what is now Ohio that has a pretty weird history. At the beginning of sort of recorded history, before the Western European colonies settled in what is now America, it was inhabited by the Erie people and tribes. After a war between the Erie and the Iroquois wiped out basically almost the entirety of the Erie tribes, it was then settled by the Seneca. Eventually, King Charles II granted the land to the colony of Connecticut, and then after the Revolutionary War, the U.S. government was forced to surrender the portion of this Western Reserve that resided within Pennsylvania. But the state of Connecticut, the now state of Connecticut, kept its claim to the Ohio portion and beyond out west. This remaining portion then got sold to a private company called the Connecticut Land Company, which was a group of investors from the newly formed state of Connecticut. In 1796 was when that sale happened. What they had planned to do was then cut up this reserve of land into different plots to create homesteading and farmland plots for settlers coming from the east moving out west. This actually got stopped initially because there were still indigenous titles and claims to the land that had not yet been sort of extinguished. and there was two particular treaties that had to sort of be navigated around. These were completely just sort of blown past because in 1797, surveyors were sent out to divvy up the land anyway, and this is when Cleveland was founded. So where he's actually at is tied to kind of this process. The area then was briefly called New Connecticut, but sovereignty over the area by the state of Connecticut was ceded in 1800, and that area was then absorbed into the Northwest Territory, which was not technically a state in the Union. And in the Northwest Territory, for those who don't know, is like what is now Michigan and Wisconsin and Illinois and Indiana and Ohio. It's sort of what we kind of define loosely as the Midwest now, with the map of America being what it is. Later, this area, specifically within the Northwest Territory, kind of became an abolitionist hub. Specifically, all three of John Brown's sons smuggled slaves across Lake Erie and into Canada to help them obtain their freedom. And there was a lot of instances in which extradition was attempted out of this area for these slaves and for abolitionists who, at the time, were technically breaking the law. But the governor of the Ohio region of the Northwest Territory always refused extradition. So it became this very sort of intense autonomous zone that had some pretty advanced political ideas for the time. By the mid-20th century, however, it became a hub of industry and resource development, particularly the center of the steel industry by the 1800s. So all of this, like, sort of reading came to me to question, like, why this space? Why is this important to Pynchon? For one, it's sort of ties in with some of the stuff from Mason and Dixon with map drawing, and how a lot of the, like, quote-unquote ownership of land is really dubious and doesn't mean anything. This is a particular plot of land that has had a ton of different groups of people live in it over time. A ton of different regions have claimed ownership of it. It's Ohio, but like Earl is saying within the book, it looks like more Connecticut shifted west. You know, the architectural style is one thing, and the name of the area is a completely different thing. But not only that, it's these sort of cycles of transformation that it underwent from being an autonomous zone known for its freedom and its helping of enslaved peoples to a center of capitalism. You know, during its abolition area, these places were known for protecting slaves from extradition, as well as the people who were helping them. But by the time that the Northwest Territory was cut up into states and absorbed within the United States, it all sort of went away, and then immediately started to pop up as a center for industry. Once that Northwest Territory was gone, the whole thing sort of changed, and thus kind of brings in that Pynchonian element of what happens when modernity arrives, when modernity advances, when capitalism shows up, when industry shows up, when we start cutting up areas into smaller portions, and then those smaller portions into these even smaller portions, and how that changes the people who live there. You know, initially when this Northwest Territory was founded, it was a virtually undisturbed, you know, Edenic landscape, one that the characters partially kind of traverse into over the course of Mason and Dixon. But by the time that the urban development arrived, the previous populations of French, Anglos, and indigenous people that were residing there had gone through wars against one another, multiple giant losses for the U.S., multiple complete deportations or massacres of the indigenous population had happened. And, you know, eventually the U.S. forces completely took over the region and tried to absorb it into the U.S. by declaring a right of conquest against the native tribes. And then as soon as that land begins to get despoiled and the arrival of modernity shows up, as it always does, the steel industry starts. That starts the whole expansion of you know, building heights and everything in America. And of course, all of this is being done along the Cuyahoga River, which is most famous for the fact that it's been lit on fire 14 times as a result of pollution from that industry. So it's one of these elements of, does he directly put it on the page why this is important? No. But if you do the research on a close reading, and if you go through that, you end up with this understanding that this plot of land that is being traversed over by Merle and by these characters in such a significant way for the period of history this book is covering is just one in a giant confluence of historical events that mean a lot of different things, especially to a person like Pynchon in what he chooses to cover and what he finds interesting. So that is kind of my condensed 2 hours of research and reading that I did over the course of the past couple of days for this section specifically.
Yeah, and I mean, whatever it's called that you were just talking about, the Western Connecticut Reserve or whatever, it's definitely a historical thing, but it was also at one point, I want to say it was the original 13 colonies. I think they tried to claim that like all land that was west of them would be their territory. So like Georgia would stretch all the way to California. I think it just encompassed that whole thing. Like they tried to claim all that land as their own, which is a historical part of American history. And I do think that that's a smaller, or that the example against today is a smaller example of that.
Yeah, 100%.
Here I was thinking that Pynchon was just psychic, and foresaw that in 18 years Ohio would become synonymous with cliche and dull. The only thing I would add to that is that the Mason-Dixon line ends very briefly before the Ohio border, and it just kind of in that simple way is kind of the start of the frontier era of America from the perspective of that what's his dang name, the historian that was discussed the previous chapter, Frederick Turner.
Frederick Jackson Turner. Yep. Yeah, you're right.
Anyway, yeah, just the start of the frontier, but just the start.
Mm-hmm. Especially given the fact that whole era represents the frontier in a lot of the ways that that Pynchon likes to kind of analyze himself as being the last sort of opportunity that America had to do anything good. Intersecting with this is, of course, this kind of episode involving a criminal named Blinky Morgan. Blinky Morgan is quite an interesting history if you if you read through it. It covers it pretty well in the book, but basically he was a member of a gang, and one of the gang members that he sort of ran with, so to speak, got arrested, and the rest of that crew went to go break him out of the train, I believe it was, that was carrying him to a prison, and in the process of breaking him out, killed like a police officer and injured, if not killed, a lot of other people. And then he kind of disappeared off into the ether, so to speak. And so that's another real piece of history that you can go and read about that kind of intersects with all of this. We do also get a reference, of course, to the Northern Ohio Insane Asylum, or in real life it was known as the Northern Ohio Lunatic Asylum. This is the second public asylum established in Ohio. This later became a state hospital, and it was considered to be kind of an advanced medical establishment for its time. The completion of it was in 1855, as far as when it was built and then later opened. So we get another sort of real piece of history as far as the actual place that they're setting this in. Although there was not a bunch of crazy lightitarians running around in there wondering whether or not the aether was going to be proved real, at least not that I could find. From there, we get the explanation of kind of the aether and how it would potentially operate if it was real, which we already sort of covered at the beginning of the chapter here, the beginning of our discussion. And then we're introduced to Roswell Bounce. Do we have any thoughts on his name beyond the obvious?
I guess I need to ask what you mean by the obvious.
The fact that when he's introduced, he's talking about cosmic space, weather balloons, that there's a U.S. sort of bureau that's in charge of reporting weird incidences like this. Seems like potential allusions to the actual Roswell incident in New Mexico.
Yeah, okay. Then to springboard off of that, the only other thing I would add is it's at least implied that one of his descendants is in Gravity's Rainbow. There's a Dr. Hilary Bounce who has a fairly key conversation with Tyrone Slothrop. But in both books, the characters surnamed Bounce give more primary characters key information that help them through the next part of their lives. And so I'm not sure what to talk about as far as Hillary Bounce here, because there's just a lot going on around that character in Gravity's Rainbow, despite not doing all that much. But this guy, he is, in some sense, he is the springboard for Merle's photography career. He is the bounce into the stratosphere for him.
As someone who resides in New Mexico, do you have any thoughts on Roswell?
I've got a lot of thoughts on Roswell. It's not a great city. Don't recommend spending time there if you don't have to.
I can't say that I've ever been.
Again, I don't want to badmouth it. I know quite a few lovely people from Roswell. It's not it isn't the ass crack of America. But it is just a tourist trap at this point. Basically just oil money and people coming through to talk about aliens. With regard to the UFO stuff, I even had multiple university lectures about all of that stuff. I don't think it's a very useful thing to get into here.
Fair enough. From there, does someone want to read the paragraph starting with Merle found himself more often than not the monkey in the middle on 61?
Merle found himself more often than not the monkey in the middle, trying to calm the dangerously fervid, find work for those who ran short, put people up in the wagon when landlords got mean, trying meantime to stay reasonably unentangled with money-making schemes which, frankly, though plentify as fungi after the rain, verged all too often on the unworkably eccentric. Amount of light in the universe being finite and diminishing fast enough so that damming, diversion, rationing, not to mention pollution, become possibilities like water rights, only different, and there's sure to be an international scramble to corner light. We have the know-how, the world's most inventive engineers and mechanics. All we need is to get far enough out to catch the prevailing flows.
So this is where, again, we get into the kind of commerce and capitalist angle of this book, this concept that, as these things advance, there's going to be an attempt to corner something like light, which is literally just, it's shouldn't be considered a commodity. It literally kind of can't be. But then, of course, you get into technology like light bulbs. You get into technology like electricity, which powers the light that people have in their homes and all of that, right? So even in cases where they can't literally go up into an aether and scoop up the light that's up there and sell it or bottle it or whatever, you do have an instance where commerce does push far enough to where a approximation of that can be owned or cornered. But it does speak to especially the fact that you have this kind of absurd statement of cornering light out of the aether, but it does mention a specific thing like water rights, which is a very real thing. In case you don't know, the Nestle guy is trying to buy up all of the water in America and the world at large to sell out to people. You also have things like air rights. The air above a building or the air above a certain space can be owned by a person. So these are not strange things in the modern world. But again, what Pynchon is going to do over the course of this chapter is going to kind of compare some of that stuff that is real and that reading this book in 2024 or whatever modern era you're reading it in, but with that kind of antiquated lens looking back on it, the setting that the book is taking place in, can kind of point out some of the absurdity of this stuff. How can you really own a plot of air, or how can you really own a plot of water, right? And that, of course, has a long history of disagreement between the indigenous people in America and the settlers, and how the concept of owning land is so far afield of anything that the indigenous people that were on this continent before the arrival of the Europeans really had any understanding of. It's really quite a neat trick that he pulls off to kind of point out some of that inherent absurdity that a modern person might just be kind of, for lack of a better term, indoctrinated into just accepting as reality.
Yeah, that paragraph especially reminded me of Bleeding Edge some and kind of the Silicon Valley, Silicon Alley way of viewing things.
Mm-hmm.
And also, have y'all seen Succession?
I have, yeah.
I have.
It reminded me of something that Conor Roy would say Connor Roy in the TV show Succession is very obsessed with water rights. It struck me as the type of like light rights would be something that Connor Roy would be into. But yeah, as you've already kind of been over, that whole paragraph, especially the dialogue, is very 21st century, very kind of like hyper capitalist, like the type of shit that billionaires would say.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned Connor Roy because he's so obsessed with water rights because his compound is in New Mexico and he's on a
True.
plot of land with no water. I have a peculiar interpretation of this paragraph that I think might be I interpret it more specifically than the general commentary, especially given that it prefaces the learning photography stuff, not immediately, but it's 2 pages later. Basically, if you're talking about cornering light in the context of photography, to take a photo is kind of it is cornering light, right? It is taking
That's
a
true.
specific perspective of light and preserving that frame of light and so that you can reflect it. And in broader ways that has, I think, some thematic relation to later commentary on television, or well, I guess earlier commentary on television in Pynchon's books, but later than this scene is set. But also, I think it needs to be said, I am the only person who hosts this show who runs Linux, so I have a duty. It's copyright, which is that same mechanism of encroachment of taking something which is viewed as the commons and placing it within a mechanism of ownership. But copyright as we know it today was initially created because people were stealing physical copies of books, taking the accreditation and the publisher's information off, and then rewrapping it with a new cover to sell it at a higher price or sell it in a market it wasn't approved for, or just to smuggle materials, information, intelligence materials. And today in 2024, copyright encompasses everything from photography to conceptual, like just ideas, just characters, all of which I think that this same time period was where that expansion of copyright as a legal concept began.
That makes sense. I can't say that I thought about that. That's good detail as well.
Switch to Linux.
Switch to Linux.
The requisite PSA.
Do we have any thoughts on Blinky's eyes? The quote specifically here says, "But you've seen his picture in the paper. Each of Blinky's eyes, according to press accounts, saw the world differently. The left one having undergone an obscure trauma, either from a premature detonation during a box job or from a naval howitzer while fighting in the rebellion." Blinky gave out a number of stories. "A walking interferometer, as you'd say," suggested Ed Adam. "A double refractor, for that." There you go. An asymmetry with respect to light, anyway. One day Merle had seen the astonishing truth of the case, though admittedly he'd been most of the night working his way from one Whiskey Hill saloon to the next drinking. Why hadn't he seen it before? It was so obvious. Professor Edward Morley and Charles Blinky Morgan were one and the same person. Separated by a couple 3 letters in the name, if alphabetically double refracted, you could say. So what are our thoughts on this aspect? This idea of the two people being one, Blinky's eyes being that interferometer, him kind of disappearing and then reappearing into the narrative. What do we think Pynchon's working towards or attempting there?
For me, I think it's mostly in isolation a funny moment, a pun on the idea of double refraction being literalized in the form of somebody who has 2 eyes that see the world fundamentally differently that have to be compromised in their mind. And then to within the book expounding on that to develop Merle's kind of loosening concept of the material world as he is trying to understand things like the horizons of science. And all of that as a broader theme in the book will continue to come up, and I think that's getting at in general the connection between cause and effect. But then again, to tie all of that back into my earlier mention of copyright and information being euphemized through light being territorialized. I think you could also see it as, in the days before we have such a density of recording, in the days before we have cell phones that people carry around that are always being GPS tracked, whether maliciously or not. Even before then, just cameras in every journalist's hands or whatever. You could disappear. You could just disappear, and that allows for the idea of being two different people in the same place, just at different times. Whereas today, that's no longer an option.
Yeah, I like your question. I mean, it does kind of remind me of. I mean, there's some discussion on the Pinton subreddit about in the last section, I believe, about Lou kind of going in and out of dimensions, perhaps him having messed up in a different dimension, and then him switching places with that version of himself and stuff. Where there is a lot of doubling in this book. The Iceland Spar thing is something that'll come up later, and I think if you place Iceland Spar like over an image, it doubles it. I want to say it's interesting to think about, but I don't know if I have a very good answer.
Yeah, particularly as it relates to this idea that Merle kind of convinces himself that somehow, this Blinky Morgan situation and the Michelson-Morley experiment are related. This concept that, like, one has to do with the other, and that if Blinky is apprehended, then the Aether is going to be dispersed. But if Blinky isn't apprehended, then the Aether is either going to continue to be kind of in a nebulous zone of is it real, is it not, or it is going to be proven to be real. And so there is almost this like Schrodinger's cat-esque reference to the idea that, like, once he re-enters the world, the experiment is fated to have a negative outcome in Merle's mind. And so when he does show back up, when he, as it says, emerges from invisibility, that dooms the Aether to a kind of non-existence. That it's gonna lead to the experiment proving that it's not real. And that is what ends up happening. The experiment finishes up. They realize that either the Aether is not real, or if it is real, then they would need some other kind of instrument to detect it, and all of the Aetherists kind of become very somber and start drinking. And in some cases, there are these cults that kind of hinge on this information that start making different choices. So I know that there's obviously something that Pynchon is working towards there. I don't know what he's trying to do with the doubling and with the kind of characters coming out of non-existence, or if someone emerges from invisibility, there's of course the implication of the character being able to kind of become invisible or step out of existence, so to speak. But it's all very interesting stuff that he's working with from that perspective of duality and doubling.
Yeah, I really do love the independent variables that are linked to an underlying variable, which they act as indicators of. I think that is a motif that, as the book goes on, I will have more to speak on.
For now, just note it as you read.
Yeah, I think it's an important motif.
Gotcha. From there, after the result of the Michelson-Morley experiments ending up, we have this conversation of whether or not the null result may actually prove the existence of the Aether. There's a reference here: the absence of light-bearing medium is the emptiness of what my religion calls akasa, which is the ground or basis for what we imagine exists. Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, Will, but this is the word in Hinduism for space, or like the cosmos, essentially.
Yeah, that's my understanding. It is the link between the all being and the us being, the material world that we interact with, not necessarily in a differentiable sense, but just it is that intersection.
We get a couple of other interpretations here. Roswell says that the Aether will turn out to be something like God. If we can explain everything we want to explain without it, then why keep it? This might be a reference to the I don't even know how to describe what this is, like the refrain or the common line that scientists will use of, like, give us one miracle and we can explain the rest, in reference to the Big Bang Theory. And then we get also this reference to, unless Ed points out it is God, somehow this escalated into a general free-for-all in which furniture and glassware didn't come out much better than the human participants. A rare sort of behavior among aetherists, but everybody had been feeling at loose ends lately. That idea of like the aether itself as God pushing the light around or causing the light to move around is, as I briefly mentioned, potentially a reference to this Aristotelian model of a proof for God. Basically, that proof for God states that there is an unmoved mover, something that if you add up all of the actions taking place, eventually goes back to the one person pushing all of those things or one mover pushing those things, which is in and of itself unmoved, and then that would be God. So there's a couple of different potential references within here to real philosophy or to real science that we now know in the modern era. And of course, this escalates eventually into an all-out brawl in the bar setting where they're at. But just another enjoyable kind of breakdown of the stuff that Pynchon has worked here.
Yeah, there's also a bit of a. This is a clearly metafictional book. If the author talking directly at you hadn't cued you in, but it makes me wonder when we're talking about metaphysics in the context of a metafictional book, whether there is some metaphor going on where somehow the book is aether. I don't know what to do with that idea.
Oh, that's an interesting concept.
Just it occurred to me earlier today, and I didn't lead me anywhere. We'll see if it develops as we continue.
Yeah. Do we have any theories about where the policeman was leaving that Roswell took a photo of that caused him to get thrown into the asylum? It's just a funny line in here in this next chapter about the asylum fire, where it says Roswell bounds who had offended a policeman by snapping his picture just as he emerged from the wrong sporting establishment.
Other than just like the idea of him not wanting to look like the kind of person who plays baseball or something, and it just being some petty, just weird, tiny little like, oh, I told my friend I don't like baseball, and now I'm coming out of the baseball field. In a Pynchon lowbrow punning sense, like Greco-Roman wrestling and the connotations.
Oh, sure, that's a good point. So Roswell is thrown in the asylum for that, and then during a dance, Merle goes in to break him out. This is apparently an establishment that is known for lighting on fire, as a fire does break out that evening, which is the second fire in 15 years. There's a lovely bit of description here that I won't read in case it's someone's quote, but they sort of help put out the fire, and then they slip off into the night. And then from there, we get a sort of final introduction to photography for Merle. Roswell sort of offers to kind of take him on as an apprentice briefly as a thank you for breaking him out of the asylum. And we get this sort of beautiful section over the course of page 64 and 65 where Roswell develops a photograph in front of him, and it's written in this magical, mystical, the photo just appears magically on the plate, and then they have to use all of these different chemicals to kind of coax that out. It's this long kind of considered process. I think it's really just beautiful stuff, and especially I love the response that Merle gives where he says, "Do one more." He knew he sounded like some rube at the fair, but couldn't help it. Even if it was only some conjuring trick, purely secular, he wanted to learn it. Just what people have been noticing ever since the first sunburn, Roswell shrugged, which is that light makes things change color. The professors call it photochemistry. Merle's all-night illumination prolonged itself into an inescapable glow that began to keep him awake. He parked the wagon out on a vacant patch in Murray Hill and set in to study the mysteries of light portraiture. As then understood, gathering information dip-fingered and without shame from every place he could, Roswell bounced to the Cleveland Library, which as Merle soon discovered had taken the revolutionary step some 10 years before the opening of its stacks. So anybody could walk in and spend all day reading what they needed to know for whatever it was they had in mind to do. And then from there, it describes him learning about different metallic compounds and different, chemicals or powders that may start in assisting with photography, but then obviously kind of as we know where Merle ends up, whether alchemy is literally alchemy or, metaphorical for just what that kind of photography looks like in the future, whatever it may be. This is obviously where all of that starts. This section is probably my favorite in these chapters. Just him learning about it and the kind of awe that he has with that technology. Because as somebody who really appreciates wet plate photography or silver gelatin, photography or that going under the hood style of photography, so to speak, there is a magic to that. There is a mysticism to that. It's a very impressive thing to be able to do. It's a crazy thing that people even found out like how to do that in the first place. It's something that I certainly have like a big interest in, and apropos of a very tenuous relation. If you haven't seen the movie Godland, I would highly recommend it. Godland is a movie about wet plate photography and how photography can be used to alter history, can be used to depict different groups of people in ways that aren't necessarily accurate to actually what they were in real life. How photography can become a colonial power. It's certainly about a whole bunch of stuff that it doesn't necessarily relate to in this section, but it deals in a similar realm of kind of the inherent like mysticism or alchemy to the process of making photos at this time. Yeah, it's easily my favorite section of the book.
And even as someone who doesn't have a personal interest in wet plate photography, it is just it's a wonderful vicarious exposition of what it is to fall in love with something.
Yeah, true enough.
Yeah, you can tell it's a passion of both Pynchon and Merle's from the way it's written.
I do also appreciate the fact that I've now learned that the definition of Hoosier is an inexperienced, awkward, or unsophisticated person. That makes me wonder why people from Indiana refer to themselves that way.
I wonder the same thing, yeah.
And now that happens.
I don't know. All I'll say is that in the neologism, meaning of Ohio as an adjective, in Ohio, that is how they treat Indiana. So
Yeah, that's fair.
Get take pride in it before people cut you down, right?
I think maybe you found out exactly why.
I hope that's it.
Yeah, you hope so. From there, we get the sense that Merle has kind of started up his own photography business. It says that he's starting to take portraits, and then he's starting to kind of travel around to make money doing this. Now that he kind of has the equipment and the interest and the know-how, this eventually takes him to Columbus, the not titular, the asshole of America, where Blinky Morgan is going to be set to be executed. This whole sequence is interesting because there's some very real history to this. When public executions were being done, it used to be highly attended events. People would go and like bring their families and have like picnics or lunch. Of course, in the Old West, there was like a frontier justice or mob justice element to it. There has certainly been times where merchandise has been associated with executions or with trials that lead to it. Some of this stuff also does come up with the Rosenbergs and like the public burning, to look for another sort of literature source to kind of go to. But some of this stuff seems crazy, but it really is not. Public executions were a very popular event, and so the idea that there would be all these people there for an execution that is itself not public, but is just happening, is certainly very well founded in reality of history, both in America and in Europe and other areas of the world where they were done.
Yeah, and there are public executions in Mason and Dixon, and especially Mason and Dixon, but there's also one in Gravity's Rainbow later in Gravity's Rainbow.
I wonder, kind of riffing off of, I think Luke has been the one who's mentioned it at least the most so far in our coverage of Against the Day, talking about this period being, kind of an important inflection point in the development of our world as we live in it today. The beginning of the book had the Chums of Chance reminding Merle and Chevrolet McAdoo that they are no longer private, even in the middle of the woods with no one around them, because an airship could fly by. Then in Bleeding Edge, you have all of those very conspicuous statements about innocence, and I do wonder if there isn't some degree of relation between those things in Pynchon's understanding of history, public executions going away, and this idealization of innocence.
Yeah, I mean, you're certainly supported by the text there too, because as sort of Merle goes through the crowd and leads to this sort of eventual disgust, but momentarily being kind of caught up in it with the merchandise, and there's someone who runs up to him and is like, "Hey, you should really try to get in there and just like take a photo of it. Like that's what you really should be doing. Why are you taking a photo of all this other stuff?" And then Merle briefly thinks to himself, yeah, that's actually right. And then not only realizes that like that's a gross thing to want to do, but also that this whole spectacle itself is disgusting, which certainly does, of course, lead into to more points about, again, the expansion of commerce and the acceleration of capitalism, the idea that you would have, little stuffed Blinky dolls and different, other tchotchkes that have something to do with this execution taking place. But what he does is he goes out and he exposes all of his photos that he took so that they're not sort of retrievable. And it does specifically say, alarmed at what had seemed a dangerously morbid lapse, he uncovered all the plates he'd taken and left them out in a vacant lot under the daylight to return to blankness and innocence. So the text certainly does directly use that word as well in that kind of the erasing of this element of it, have some kind of a return in innocence fundamentally. And of course that leads into the great insult about Columbus. Does someone want to read that quote about the U.S. sitting down?
As if the light of heaven had performed a similar service for his brain, Merle understood that he must never, if he could avoid it, set foot within the limits of this place again. If the U.S. was a person, he later became fond of saying, and it sat down, Columbus, Ohio would instantly be plunged into darkness.
Just a great roundabout insult.
When I read through this for the podcast, I was reminded of Mason and Dixon, and I can't remember if that was just, either Luke, or Cody referencing this moment during our conversations, or if that joke comes up in that book as well.
The Pynchon Wiki does say Merle stole this gag from Mason and Dixon, so it seems like there's something textual there, but I don't know specifically. I don't remember, I should say, the quote or the moment that it takes place. From there, we learn that Merle never got a chance to use Professor Vanderjuice's letter of introduction to meet Mickelson. By the time that he would have been able to use it, Mickelson was already gone and has now become a big star within the world of science. Has no reason to talk to amateurists, I guess, or people outside of the realm of academia anymore. So as a result of that, Blinky has been executed, and this kind of, I guess I should say, chapter in Merle's life is essentially over. Roswell Bounce runs off to appear in Pittsburgh regarding a court case, and at this point, Merle meets Erlis, and they end up sort of taking up together. And as a result of that, they have a child shortly after. We get a reference here to why she might have left. And it seems like it potentially has to do with the fact that Merle may have been shooting pornography, between the fact that he's called the Beast Without Shame, between the fact that, like, women get involved, and when the women get involved, like, stuff suddenly starts to really go off as far as the kind of protesting about their presence or the kind of anger about Merle and Erlis's presence being around, and that this potentially was a sort of founding motivation for Erlis to leave him as he's telling his daughter. Do we have any other theories about why this paragraph, and specifically about, like, considering the life we were trying to lead, deputies with court orders way before breakfast, patent lawyers, vigilantes with shotguns, worst of all those town ladies, herds of locusts, no end to them, torchlight rallies waving signs on sticks, beast without shame, so forth. She could soldier on when it was just the men after me, but them sisters in indignation, why, she couldn't bear much of that. It's women beware women when that starts rolling down the pike. Oh, but beg pardon, you're all about to be one yourself, ain't you? So sorry there. Do we have any thoughts about what he was doing, or is it just sort of generally our thought that it had to do with pornography?
I think it definitely has to do with pornography, and I would go even further and say that that's related to why Erlis leaves him, if not the actual reason that Erlis leaves him. On the following page, Erlis is asked, "Could you stand perfectly still while somebody throws knives at you?" And Erlis responds, "Been known to hold still for worse than that," which has the whole having sex with Merle is maybe not super enjoyable aspect or something with that, but also at this time you had to stand still for photography, and I do think it is possible and maybe even probable that Merle is using her as his subject for his lewd photos, and maybe she feels coerced. But yeah, I definitely think the pornography angle is in there.
Just to continue pointlessly pushing back on the porn interpretation, because I don't have any basis for it. I just think it in the same way that good and evil are being defined in more broad thematic aspects. At this point in time, the idea of pornography was really just beginning to come into existence. Not just like, is this erotic art? Is this pornography? Is this just a nude picture? Like we now have those three discrete categories. Back in the olden days, any kind of photography that wasn't of like a still landscape or like a family seated probably would have raised suspicions because you had to stand there for a long time. There's a question of how you did this. But I also wonder two slants on that. Firstly, there's also herds of locusts, no end to them. And I don't believe, and there's no mention of it in this chapter, so it doesn't feel like I'm sharing notes out of school. I don't think that Erlis and Merle ever got married, so it might just have been, oh, you're living in sin, and people don't like that. And Merle is a fabulist. He makes stuff up for fun sometimes, or he is apparently being pursued by herds of locusts, and him trying to justify to Dally why Erlis would leave without trying to demonize her at all.
Mhm.
And on the other side of that slant, there's just and I'm not sure that Pynchon is a photography enthusiast, is that the angle on photography as is known today as like the Native Americans don't like having their photo taken, or they didn't like it because they thought it was stealing their soul. That was like a pretty widespread belief at the very beginning of photography as a form.
That's true.
So it might just be, hey, this guy's going around taking pictures. He's stealing some aspect of our lives, and that whole privacy angle. But
Mhm.
also, patent lawyers. He's doing stuff that Kodak probably had patents on. He is in legal trouble because he's going around taking photographs and using processes that he doesn't have a legal right to.
Okay.
So I think all of that is tied together in this paragraph.
That's a completely understandable interpretation. Do you also think that then what he's doing in the beginning of the book, I can't remember if this was your interpretation back when we did the first episode, but do you also think that he wasn't doing pornography outside the fair either?
I don't care to have an opinion on that particular
Sure.
question, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
Because
It's kind of inconsequential.
yeah, like Chevrolet is totally an exotic dancer in the time when that term made sense.
Mhm.
So it totally could have been erotic photography or pornography, wherever you wanted to draw the line between those things, and just nude photographs.
Sure.
But I think it's more salient to think about it in terms of the concept of privacy more than necessarily the obscenity of whatever is being privatized in the form of a photo.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on what like the beast without shame might be in reference to?
I don't, other than obviously Lou Bosnight and Merle Rideout are the same person.
This was when he was just the beast without shame, and he hadn't gone upstate or downstate. We don't know where he started.
He's just riding out. But no, I don't have a gloss on that at all. Do you?
No, and that part of that is really why I would think that some of that has to do with pornography. Speaking from a perspective of like, do you have no shame? Sometimes referring to kind of covering your nakedness is covering your shame. Therefore, uncovering that would be someone without shame. Certainly, this would be a more religious time. So referring to somebody as a beast without shame or a naked beast would certainly match with someone who is potentially shooting porn or, whatever they would have considered porn at that time to be, which might just be a whole lot of angle. Who knows? I can't say that I have like a very good gloss on it. It's separate from the pornography angle. But certainly what you're talking about as far as him trying to kind of give a reason for Dally's mother leaving without impugning character of her mother does make me wonder whether some elements of these are invented. Because of course we know that he is someone who likes doing stuff like that, He sarcastically joked about selling his daughter. So he could be sort of doing some kind of play acting there too, to give some credence to your interpretation or your thought.
Well, yeah, and to be even more granular with that reading, the list of petitions against him, I guess, starts with deputies with court orders, patent lawyers, vigilantes with shotguns, and then it escalates very rapidly with biblical curses, and then going into just like gothic horror tropes of people chasing you out of town.
Uh-huh.
And I think it's totally believable that if someone was making pornography, you would be chased out of town with beast with no shame on a sandwich, not a sandwich board, nope, on a picket sign.
Uh-huh.
But it could also it could be either just an expansion of the photographs are obscene, period.
Yeah.
Or any of that gray area.
Sure enough. I mean, maybe they would have made him wear a sandwich board. If he was naked and they were running him out of town, perhaps they put a sandwich board around his shoulder.
I'm not sure that's an image I want to see, but I'm glad that I thank you for giving the concept to the world.
You're welcome. From there, this turns into a discussion of how Erlis left, and we get quite a fun story, I guess is the best way that I can put it, of a time that they were parked outside of Murray Hill, or rather Murray Hill is where Luca Zombini was from. They're actually parked outside of Full Moon, Iowa, East Full Moon, Iowa specifically. And we learned that Zombini's previous stage hand ran off with the tenor sax player from the pit band at the local opera house, which is just a funny sentence because that implies that the local opera house is not showing opera. And so Zombini the Mysterious is in need of a new stage assistant. He sees Erlis come out from their wagon, and as a result starts asking a series of questions. Does someone want to read those questions that he asks? They're pretty funny. I'm trying to remember where this starts.
I've got them. Excuse me, Senora. What may seem a peculiar question, but have you ever felt you wished to suddenly disappear, even from a room full of people, just tossing his hands to suggest smoke vanishing? Gone? Me? All the time. Why? Could you stand perfectly still while somebody throws knives at you? Been known to hold still for worse than that? Flicking a glance then in Merle's direction.
And then we get sort of Merle's reaction watching all this. I love the wording of he didn't know what was happening. He did know. It's just such a perfect kind of encapsulation of how that would probably feel to watch somebody take your wife away from you in front of you, or your girlfriend or someone of significant association.
I was just going to say it's very relatable. Where I think pretty much everyone who's been in a serious relationship has experienced something like, not exactly like somebody stealing the person you're with, but the knowing and not knowing at the same time, where you suspect it, but you don't want to let yourself like fully kind of realize it.
Yeah, absolutely. Where you can kind of delude yourself mentally.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I'm saying this not trying to make fun of your phrasing because I think it's poignant. I do hope that it's not everyone who's been in a serious relationship. Because that's sad.
Maybe I'm more speaking out of my own experiences with
every single person.
Everyone on the planet.
Yeah, I think everyone has probably experienced something like that. Maybe not in a relationship, but that concept of both not knowing and knowing is certainly applicable to a lot of situations. But again, just one of those cases of Pynchon being incredibly adept at these small moments of real humanity that really nails home how a character is feeling to the reader. And it's impressive how effective some of that can be, given how little amount of time we've actually sort of known Merle for, and certainly less time that we've known their relationship. It's utilizing that factor of my reader's going to come to this with some kind of experience, because everybody in the world has experienced this. So then they kind of inject that with their own emotionality in a way that it's very effective. And certainly the same thing can be said of all of the stuff that he does with relationships between parents and children or other familiar relationships. It's just another testament to how good he can be at character writing, despite some of the criticism that we bring up all the time. From that point, they disappear in the morning, and she only leaves behind a note that says, "I'll come back for her when I can." And Merle waits around for her as long as he possibly can. And finally, when he realizes that she is truly gone and is not coming back anytime soon, if at all, they decide to take out of East Full Moon and set off into somewhere else, just sort of wandering around, taking photos and doing whatever he can to make money. And then we kind of jump forward to the fair. The fair's closed up now, and we have an absolutely amazing description of the fair being covered in this sort of thick falling snow and contrasts against winter skies. The buildings, of course, are itself white. The fairgrounds now probably don't have any of the buildings left in them, but it's to Luke's description of this section earlier when he was doing the recap. These sort of refugees of the fair, or people who were immigrating to the country, are kind of all present within this petty mix of snow in the winter after the fair had closed. And do we have any thoughts on that before we get to the man-made bad times reference that I have some detail about?
Well, I like it as kind of the flip side, both in time and just in terms of perspective, of the Chums going through that part, that outer part of the World's Fair.
Yeah.
And this is just seeing it from a far less naive perspective, even though it's, as far as I read it, mostly from Dally's point of view.
That's how I read it too.
Yeah, and she's just so much more in touch with reality than the Chums.
Yeah. Within here, we get this kind of description of the fact that this beautiful white city has been dismantled. This capital of dreams she had once lived in, maybe was even numbered among the rightful nobility of. First, she begged Merle, tearfully as she knew how, to please bring them back, please. And he never quite found the way to tell her that the fairground was, most of it surely burned down by now. Pulled to pieces, taken away to salvage yards, sold off, crumbled away, staff and scantlings at the mercy of the elements, of the man-made bad times that had come upon Chicago and the nation. After a while, her tears only refracted light but did not flow, and she dropped into silences, and then these two gradually lost their resentful edges. First of all, just like a great description of what it's like to experience kind of one of these moments of the death of innocence in childhood, like of this poor little girl realizing that this magical place that she had once kind of lived in or frolicked about through or enjoyed isn't permanent. It's a very emotional moment, but there is also this reference to the man-made bad times. This is a reference to the Panic of 1893 and then the subsequent Depression of 93 to 95. And this was another thing that I did a lot of research on over the weekend. And it's also another one of these instances where, like, sometimes you come across one of these random lines and you start researching it, and then you have an eventual aha moment, or at least I do, where you sort of get why Pynchon included it in the first place. And for this, with this being a reference to that particular economic crash, for those who don't know, that panic and then subsequent depression actually is what killed the Gilded Age. And the Gilded Age, again, for those who don't know, was largely fueled by foreign commodities prices, particularly of grain and other agricultural producers. This was a time when sort of globalization in economics was becoming a much wider aspect of how capitalistic economies ran. And sort of the new money in America was able to flow outwards to invest in those things at cheaper products. Chicago, in particular, of course, where the World's Fair is taking place or took place, has always been a hub for agricultural trading in particular. It wouldn't be until, a couple decades later that there would be kind of this move out from New York to Chicago, to the Board of Trade building there. And sort of that, of course, has its echoes in Bleeding Edge with Forrest and the work that he does. But it has long been a trading hub for that particular kind of commodity or that particular kind of resource. And in the case of this sort of time frame, what we kind of find as you look deeper into it is that there's a lot of different reasons that the 1893 crash did occur. There's a railroad bubble. South Africa and Australia had a lot of financial investment on speculative properties that failed. And there was also a run on gold bullion as a result of overmining in silver and a loss of faith in paper currency. But the biggest failure that sort of I can find or that is linked to a lot of this stuff is actually a coup that takes place in Argentina that coincides with an 1890 wheat crop failure that leads to a unsuccessful military junta, but it does oust the then president Miguel Salman. The party that ousted him was known as the Civic Union. That later split into a series of political parties that still exists in a lot of instances to this day. But their founding ideal back during this period in 1890, after that wheat crop failed, was that there was a concentration of wealth and power in a handful of elites that controlled access to political candidacies. And as a result, they controlled the access to they controlled the access to make political change, and they were able to sort of concentrate all of the power and ability to affect any sort of change within those elections. Salman, for his part, had made big overtures to Europe over the course of his presidency. He consolidated power in a way that a lot of dictators do, of course. But what he started to do was encourage European immigration and investment into the country. And as a result of kind of all of the new money flowing in and the overtures that he wanted to put out there to Europe, what he did is he started to majorly privatize what had previously been public industries. And the biggest thing that he did was he privatized the railroad system. So he sold that off to a foreign investor. He sold a bunch of their farmland to a foreign investor, and he kept accepting all of this money that came in, which did, for a time, revitalize a lot of the stuff in the country. They fixed their roads, they built more railroad tracks, they put up fencing, they had all of this agricultural crop that they were selling off, their exports changed and increased in their value. But at the same time, Salman and his administration started spending large. But as long as the money kept coming in, this didn't matter, and nobody sort of noticed. As a result of that, naturally, with the privatization expansion of the previously national infrastructure, he expanded the stock exchange in Argentina, and that made, again, access to foreign investment even easier and wider in its actual like monetary value. His spending increased, which should have ruined the country, but again, there was so much foreign investment that nothing happened at first. This was one of the most crazy things I found. The economy not only grew by 44%, but the British government at one time during this whole kind of speculative bubble was spending all of its 44%, or 40% rather, I'm sorry, of its foreign investment was all going to Argentina. So that's just how much sort of the floodgates of money and capital from Europe and America was into the country. What kind of killed this party and then led to the Depression itself taking place in 1893 to 95 is that one of the major Argentine banks collapsed, which led to a lot of other banks having payment crises or having debt repayment plan crises. That then led to one particular European bank failing, and then as a result, all of these dominoes, fell one after the other in a succession that we find that leads to that depression that kills the Gilded Age. And I think that it's a particularly smart kind of usage of this history by Pynchon, not to depict how all of that goes through a longer description of kind of these capitalist workings, but through simply depicting it as the effect that it has on a child, and that you're sad for the fact that this child is sort of experiencing this moment where they're losing some innocence, and where they're realizing that the world is not this magical place, even when magical places do seem to exist in the world. And even without that historical context that I've just kind of explained being in place, it still is just as effective as a section of the book. It's one of the best descriptive periods of it, from how the fair looks, but then also to how the emotions play into that relationship with Dally and where she's at as she realizes that kind of that period of her life is over where she got to live at the fair. But it's also just, again, another illustration of just some of Pynchon's best writing so far in this book, between this and some other sections we'll get to next.
So thanks for walking through that entire, I'm going to say gloss again, even though I said it too many times. And I mean, usually when I think I'm glad there's a minister on the show, it's because of a more direct religious allusion. But I do think that if it weren't for your seminary background, you might not have made that specific connection.
Yeah, it's possible.
Yeah, just something about reading that paragraph, coming away with the loss of innocence, and then springboarding that into the broader economical framework, I think that's a very specific insight that it totally makes sense. And again, thank you for being on the show.
Thanks, Will. So from there, Merle and Dally decide to ride out into the Midwest, and we get another excellent just moment of nature writing from Pynchon. It's one of the best paragraphs in this whole section of pages, but it's also it's one paragraph in say 5 or 6 pages where there's almost a paragraph on each of those pages that is equally well written as their sort of journey continues to progress out. I particularly love the last line where it says they lived for different futures, but they were each other's unrecognized halves, and what fascination between them did come to pass was lit up beyond question of race. I just like that line is beautiful, but it's one line in a paragraph full of them, and it does speak again to this ability that Pynchon has to imbue his books with warmth, especially as it relates to relationships between fathers and daughters. It seems to be the thing that he operates with a lot, but it's not exclusive to that. Between fathers and sons, just familial relationships, or any kind of bonding moment that exists between friends or family or whatever. He's very, very good at bringing that warmth along with his text to kind of really sell to the reader what it's like to be in relationships with people in your life that have that big. He maybe does that better than most writers do, and he has this way of almost telling a short story in one paragraph, or in just a couple of sentences for a couple of paragraphs, that I think is unlike any other author that I've read.
This section of the chapter and the book is just it is a perfect example of the idea of prose poetry.
Yeah. In case you're ever needing a clean definition to give somebody of that, just point them to this chapter.
Here, read these three or 4 paragraphs out of context.
I promise you, they will be affecting. I do also love this usage that Merle has of Chinese mythology, or sort of folklore. Chinese believe the root is a small person who can hear you coming and so forth. We're Chinese? He shrugged as if he wasn't sure. Doesn't mean it ain't true. I love that particular perspective on these different statements or ideas about life and sort of what things may mean. And then, of course, we get another situation where Dally asks if they're going to try and find her mom, and it's very obvious that every time she brings this up, like it's hard for Merle to not necessarily lie to her, but kind of obscure the fact that like she's not coming back. There's not really much of a reason for us to go looking for her either. And I also love the kind of like running sort of not really anxiety, but I guess acceptance that Merle has that at some point Dally is just going to go find her herself. That like that's an inevitability, and when it does come and that sort of underlying thread is resolved, it's really quite excellent because again that is just sort of a reality of how a lot of these relationships go. Children who grow up with only one parent often want to go find the other parent, or adopted children who learn they're adopted want to find their birth parents. The dynamic between these two characters, this father and this daughter, is really quite something special. We then are treated to another one of these these prose poetry paragraphs. It's just wonderful, and which just leads into another one to close out both 71 and then the beginning of 72 up until the page break. And then as we come back from the page break, it's just beautiful. Does someone want to read that first paragraph as Merle watched her sleep?
As Merle watched her sleep, an unmanly warmth about the eyeballs would surprise him. Her hearth-colored hair and a careless child's snarl. She was somewhere off wandering those dangerous dark fields, maybe even finding there some version of himself, querulous, that he'd never get to hear about, among the sorrowful truths, being lost, being found, flying, journeying to places too detailed to be anything but real, meeting the enemy, dying, being born over and over. He wanted to find a way in, look out for her at least, keep her from the worst if he could.
It's just amazing writing. Like that's really all I have to say. Like I'm not a parent. I don't think that that's a particular thing that I'm ever going to be. I don't have much of a desire to be, but like this, I think, does a great job of depicting what my parents have told me about like watching your kids grow up or wanting to like take care of your children in a way that is very intensely emotionally affecting. Of not just like watching your child get older, but realizing that you're not going to be able to protect your kid and that things are going to happen to your child that you're going to wish never did, and you're going to want to be in a position to take that pain away from them or to safeguard them, but you also know that's not possible. It's just really great stuff. It's stuff that I think was largely background in Vineland. Like you understood that was how Zoid felt about his daughter, but here it's really pushed to the foreground in a way that I appreciate. And I think that this is one benefit of having a longer book, is you do have time for moments like this. Because while it's small, if you're writing a book that's only 300 pages, you maybe don't have as much time for it.
Yeah, and I what I really particularly like about what Luke read was, yes, there is the shade of like, oh, there's terror in the dreams, but it is also the, compared to some of the other stuff, especially in Bleeding Edge, we saw about the experience of being a parent. What we get here is just like a good moment, a moment of, yes, there is the vicarity of being a parent, period, but there's just, he wishes he could be with her in her dreams, and that in itself is a beautiful idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And then from there we get the moment that again took me off guard. Wasn't planning on crying over the course of reading these pages, but did anyway. Where it continues and it says, waiting out there for them each day, bright green and wet, or leafless and frozen. There's always that map crisscrossed with pikes and highways and farm to market roads, for their scratchy eyelids to open and regard as if from above, as if having risen into the dawn-orange skies and hovered, scanning like journeyman hawks for the next day's work, which more and more turned out to be some street corner picture operation in another little prairie town to get them through a couple more meals. As years went along, the film got faster, the exposure time shorter, the cameras lighter. Primo came out with a celluloid film pack allowing you to shoot 12 at a time, which sure beat class plates. And Kodak started selling its Brownie, a little box camera that weighed practically nothing. Merle could bring it anywhere, as long as he held everything steady in the frame. And by then, the old glass plate folding models having weighed in at 3 pounds plus plates, he had learned to breathe, calm as a sharpshooter, and the images showed it. Steady, deep. Sometimes, Dally and Merle agreed, more real. Though, they never got into real that far. It's something that Pynchon has kind of already primed you to be in an emotional state because of the stuff that he's been writing as far as the relationship between, Merle and Dahlia is concerned, but also in such juxtaposition between the moment where Merle learns how to develop film and then like obsessively learns everything there is about these chemicals and these compounds and how the actual image shows up and the kind of mercurial nature of capturing light in a glass plane to potentially, create this great work of art if you're lucky enough. To now it's just this box that barely weighs nothing and I can just, I don't have to carry anything around. I can just press a button and, we're kind of good to go. Like it does strip all of that magic out. It really does. And that I think more than anything that Pynchon has written from a fictional perspective, it evokes this thing in me of like, yeah, I do actually want to be a Luddite. Let's go smash all of the weaving frames and reject all of this stuff, because it is true that like if Merle had learned photography by picking up a Kodak Brownie, or by even further in history when it gets even easier to take photographs, then that element of magic of watching that image suddenly appear on the plate when he's working with Roswell, and of that obsessive need to like soak up information and read all this stuff at the library, it's not there. And that kind of inherent magic in how that era of technology operated is gone. And of course that, some of that comes up at the end of this chapter that we'll of course get to. But it did evoke like big emotions in me. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that in addition to this section, we get the understanding that as Pynchon sees it, and as we have kind of lived through, especially in the 2020s, the further that technology has kind of gotten along, the, for lack of a better term, like eviler it's gotten. We've already talked about privacy or surveillance already in this episode. We talked extensively about it over the course of the Bleeding Edge season, where we were talking about like the internet as a thing of potential for good, for freedom, for unlimited expression of ideas and so on and so forth, and then it just got co-opted and turned into this again cog in sort of the capitalist machine, just seeks to make profit at the expense of, nowadays it feels like sometimes, the individuality or like humanity of the people utilizing it. And all of that stuff does start back with these initial advances. I realize I probably sound a bit like some kind of like, geezer yelling about how bad stuff is now because, sandwiches cost $9 and I don't understand why it is that my nephew won't call me on this fangled contraption that I have. But like, I think that there is a kernel of truth to that idea that as soon as you explain something, the magic of it goes away. And that was a huge part of Mason and Dixon. That as soon as you divide up the land, the magic goes away. That entrance to the Hollow Earth gets smaller. As soon as you, explain away these different aspects of kind of the inherent mysticism or the Edenic nature of creation before it's despoiled by modernity, that beauty and that sort of seed of the divine goes away. A huge part of that book. And it's showing up now in ways that are a bit more banal. This doesn't require two people to spend years cutting a line across one section of land. Just takes someone making a, $5 purchase at the corner store or whatever. And yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I even would have had the same reaction to that information if I hadn't been reading these books with you guys for the last 2 years and having an opportunity to compare and contrast all of these details. But this paragraph evoked a lot of feelings in me unexpectedly.
Well, as an information fetishist, I'm gonna have to push back against the explanation robbing things of the magic.
Mm-hmm.
But more productively, I think I do think there's a distinction there, even in the text here, because you have Merle learning how it works with the wet photography, and
Hmm.
that's what mystifies him. It is that explanation. But to your point, this is like this exact transition point from wet plate photography to celluloid film is kind of the epitome of the term inherent vice, in the
Sure,
sense,
yeah.
because the inherent vice it's come up many times, both the book title and the concept in our podcast. But so the baseline level is like, okay, you can't ensure something against an inevitable result. But if you're talking about celluloid film, celluloid as a material is so reactive that many storehouses of film have just gone up in smoke and burned within minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of those things where, at the very least, this particular technological turn was not good, despite the fact that like a wet glass plate is not going to be preserved long term either. But at least you have the awareness of it.
Yeah, very true.
Like there's no delusions for someone taking lithographs.
Yeah, that's true.
But,
Yeah.
The Warner Brothers storage warehouse, sat idle for like 60 years before it just went up in smoke one day.
This is why film archives are most commonly in salt mines.
Which won't even help that much either, because
No, not really.
it does supply its own fuel for the flame.
From there, we get this kind of brief aside involving Skip, the sentient ball lightning. Essentially, Merle starts taking some odd jobs across the country now that kind of photography has started to change, and he's doing jobs that involve electricity. He's selling lightning rods. He's working out all sorts of different kind of contract jobs, and eventually someone basically asks what he has to do with ball lightning, because that's the kind of stuff that they have out there. Have any of you guys experienced ball lightning before? I certainly have not.
I have not.
Yeah, I mean, living in the desert, it's always possible that I have and didn't take note. But it's very, like, the idea that anywhere is a hotbed for ball lightning is kind of in itself mystical.
Yeah, because if I understand correctly, ball lightning is basically just like a concentrated, for lack of a term, ball of lightning that doesn't dissipate immediately, which would probably be insane to actually like witness.
Well, my impression is that it is like a semi-mythical thing, that it really hasn't been documented in the modern era.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't done deep research into it, but it is just it's one of those things that, as far as we understand lightning to function, it shouldn't ever happen.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess, it's always possible that a specific swirl of the air will have just enough conductance to, I don't know. I don't know enough about electricity to come up with a plausible theory.
Yeah, Wikipedia says ball lightning is a rare and unexplained phenomenon described as lumescent spherical objects that vary from pea-sized to several meters in diameter, though usually associated with thunderstorms. The observed phenomenon is reported to last considerably longer than the split-second flash of a lightning bolt, and is a phenomenon distinct from St. Elmo's fire and will-o'-the-wisp. Some 19th century reports describe balls that eventually explode and leave behind an odor of sulfur. Descriptions of ball lightning appear in a variety of accounts over the centuries and have received attention from scientists. An optical spectrum of what appears to have been a ball lightning event was published in January 2014 and included a video at high frame rate. Nevertheless, scientific data on it remains scarce. Although laboratory experiments have produced effects that are usually visually similar to reports of ball lightning, how these relate to the supposed phenomenon remains unclear. But yeah, so it may be real, it may be not, we don't know. But certainly it is associated with stuff of this period. If you go and look up the Wikipedia page for it, the image is actually a drawing that is from 1901 and is meant as a depiction of what it may look like. And what we get is an actual ball lightning event occurs with Merle, and it just sort of hovers in front of him long enough that Merle feels compelled to speak to it. And when he does, surprisingly enough, it talks back to him. To his surprise, the ball lightning replied, though not exactly out loud, "Sounds fair. My name is Skip. What's yours?" "Pleasure, Skip. I'm Merle," said Merle. "Just don't send me to the ground. It's no fun there." "Okay. And forget that cage. Deal." Slowly, they became sidekicks. And so Merle takes this ball of lightning out with him. It helps provide some illumination to his daughter when she's reading at night. When it travels with them, it kind of just sits in their oil lamp container. And it's just sort of this random aside where Dally starts to see the ball lightning Skip as maybe like a sibling of some kind, all before it suddenly gets called back home to the cloud or the kind of electromagnetic charge or whatever it may be that it spawned from out in Kansas. What do we think about this this sort of random aside?
I mean, it in some ways could speak to, the kind of. I think it's included as just kind of a cool little, small story within the larger story, but it could also kind of speak to how lonely Dally is. She's not shown it's never stated that she goes to school. It's unclear how much time she spends around people her own age. The only person we ever see her interact with, at least in this section of the book, is her father. I guess she interacts with the Chumps of Chance and maybe Lou in the previous section. But it could speak to her loneliness and her desperation to have a companion.
I mean, it's hardly the first inanimate object in Pynchon's books to talk to people.
Certainly.
It might be the only one that isn't like even situated within the framework as either mystical or as possibly delusional. But it's interesting. When I read it the first time, what occurred to me was the idea of Boltzmann brains, which I'm only bringing up because the Pynchon wiki cites Ludwig Boltzmann, the Austrian physicist, as apparently in 1877 being one of the first people to postulate that light may be a discrete quantity rather than simply a waveform. But the Boltzmann brain is, as described on Wikipedia, a thought experiment, but it is basically just the concept that was coined by the same physicist that, as far as we understood, at least when he was alive, as far as he understood the mind and what minds are, that at least hypothetically, even just like a cloud of gas in the vacuum of space could become sentient in a meaningful sense. And that using that to extrapolate into ideas of panentheism, or simply just like the idea that to think is not some human privilege. Like, we're not special because we think. Not just do dogs also think. Not just do cows and sometimes trees in Pynchon's books, but even light bulb filaments or just plasma, just a ball of plasma floating through the air. It has enough going on to construct consciousness. No real conclusions there, except that it's that same kind of through line of the line between science and religion, science and philosophy, being so blurred at this time, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it certainly seems like this is one of those things that when you do like look back through all of those reports of it, it is largely from the 1800s, like mid to late 1800s, or a few instances from the early 1800s. One of them is from Aleister Crowley, weird enough, but most of it comes from that era, where it does seem like, and of course that leads into the last section of this chapter, where they talk about alchemy very specifically, that this is an era that kind of was the end of some of this more magical stuff, whether it's photography and how that works with images just sort of appearing, or the feeling that you're capturing light in a very real way, or ball lightning happening with some regularity, that an area could be known for it, or these different things like the aether, like there was an air of mystery or intrigue to the world that was from that unexplained angle, or from that kind of esoteric angle, and that when you push past it, some of that does go away, and that I think you could extrapolate out to having some degree of interaction with consciousness or belief turning into some sort of consciousness or something along those lines. But I, much like yourself, Will, it's a lot of like half-formed thoughts in my idea, or in my memory, or in my brain, sorry, that I can't quite point towards a conclusion point on it. But it is, much like any of the other moments where there is inanimate objects suddenly turned animate, there's a degree of melancholy and a degree of sweetness to this moment, where, as soon as this child starts to grow some degree of attachment, it has to go away. It has to go join his own family, so to speak. And is, another one of these moments in Dally's kind of development into a young adult or a teenager at the very least, that we kind of get to bear witness to, that makes her the person that she is eventually. Of course, this is a moment where I'm going to invite the listeners that if they have any theories, they should email us, and we'll talk about them if you come up with anything.
Yeah, I really, particularly in the broader context of this chapter, I really do like the bit about Dally asking Skip if it would be possible for him to come back after rejoining his proverbial family with the lightning storm. Because so much of this chapter is suffused with grief, and it's kind of bookended with Merle's own thoughts about Erlis leaving. And in this central portion is so much about Dally dealing with the feeling of abandonment.
Yeah.
And in this microcosm of a humanity in the form of this ball lightning boy, you have this microcosm of a lot of different cultures' ideas of the afterlife, where it is just like this agglomeration of consciousness that is reincarnated as the next birth after someone dies. There might be some part of the person, but they're not there. The them is not there anymore, at least.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a part of me that wishes that it would be easier to make the claim that this is an imaginary friend scenario, but unlike the moment in the White City where that does very much feel like it comes from Dally's perspective, this section feels like it's much more from Merle's perspective. And so there isn't as much sort of textual support for that idea, but there is a part of me that, like you're kind of talking about, Will, with the grief that this whole section is sort of suffused with, this idea that, like, this child is so affected by the abandonment of her mother, even though at this point she probably doesn't remember that happening, that even in the case of her creating an imaginary friend to have some degree of companionship, that imaginary friend still does, in its own way, abandon her. And that there are these moments of grief from that very early childhood that she doesn't remember but knows happen, that, suffuse themselves into her imagination and the way that she creates relationships between things in her life. So that's another thing that I certainly think of, but of course there isn't much textual support for the idea that this is an imaginary friend that she has come up with.
That's a good insight. I mean, at the very least, it promotes an interpretation of between Merle and Dally, them. Like, even if you want to take even if you want to believe in the material reality of Merle doing these lightning rod installations and coming upon a ball lightning and setting up a trap, you could, I guess, come to like, oh, he trapped it somehow and kept it in a box, and it was just a lamp for them.
Mm-hmm.
And she, as a child, allows herself to personify it, but both of their grief is in that, in a thematic sense, is in the ball lightning.
Yeah, that would be a good way to make that. But fittingly, from there, talking about the big abandonment that did happen to her, Merle does end up finding a magazine in a cigar store, that illustrates where Erlis has gone. And it has this lovely picture printed using a new photo printing process of her and Zombini and what appears to be 12 children that the two of them had. And it's got this whole sort of profile on the two of them. Also, just an aside, I love the name Dishforth's Illustrated Weekly. Just what a name for a magazine. And so Merle realizes he needs to buy it and needs to bring it home to Dally. And so does exactly that. And Dally doesn't really say much, but does tuck away the magazine, which clearly is a indication that this is the newest thing that she's collected in an effort to figure out her mom is. Except we get another one of these moments of just like this real sadness or grief or whatever word you want to apply to it, where earlier when she was younger, she has this assumption that the two of them are going to go find Erlis together. But now that she knows exactly where it is that she's at, she doesn't make that assumption anymore. She doesn't even suggest it. But Merle does understand that she is going to eventually go to New York on her own at some point. And it is one of those moments coupled with the line where he mentions that like she's going to cause a lot of trouble for some cowboys somewhere or something like that. I don't remember exactly where that quote is. That getting that line and then this one really illustrates that growth into her own person and her own sort of individual with a separate identity and a separate sort of path for her future than her father, which is one of those moments of just like real like my child is grown and is going to leave the house and I can't do anything about it. It's one of those moments where again Pynchon puts it in a way that is very affecting emotionally, even to someone who doesn't have children reading the book.
Yeah, I mean, just that line about her hair in the wind, a banner flown by the only force he'd ever sworn allegiance to.
Mm-hmm.
Just so much love in that framing.
Yeah. I have, if there's one, I think, notation that I've come away with over the course of doing this podcast with you guys for nearly 2 years, the way that he writes parental love is just very beautiful. It makes me wish he was my dad because it sounds like he probably cares a lot about his son. This is when we are eventually introduced to quite an interesting guy named Webb Travers. Again, just a wonderful name. In Colorado, they found a farm outbuilding forgotten years earlier after the farm went under and the farmhouse burned down, leaving this overgrown shed which Merle managed to fill up to the rafters with photographers, or if you like, alchemist stuff. Containers ranging from banged up vegetable cans to jugs and bottles holding liquids or powders of different colors. Gigantic glazed crocks, 50 gallons and more, that you might be able to lift empty but wouldn't necessarily want to. Carefully bent glass tubes and copper coils running every place. A small forge over in one corner, an electric generator hooked to an old bicycle. Battery cells dry and wet. Electromagnets, burners, and a annealing oven, a workbench littered with lenses, developing tanks, exposure meters, printing frames, magnesium flash lamps, a gas-heated rotary burnishing machine, and other stuff Merle had almost forgotten he had. Berry vines crept in the crevices and spiders adorned the stash work with webs that when the early daylight was right could cause you to stand there just stupefied. Most folks who showed up thought he was running a still. Sheriff's boys liked to come by at odd hours, and sometimes, depending how the day was proceeding, Merle would bring out the heavier science talk, which hypnotized them into going away. Disappointed as always, other days the visitors were as likely to be polarized the other way, legally speaking. So we kind of get an idea of where he's at now that he's a bit older, and they've kind of settled down with this weird sort of area of Colorado out of the Midwest. I'm gonna pose this question at the beginning as opposed to towards the end. But that line of filled to the rafters with photographers, or if you like, alchemist stuff. Do we think that he's actually become an alchemist as an outgrowth of his interest in chemicals used for photography initially? Or do we think that this is an illustration that to a younger person who does not have as intimate of a knowledge of what wet plate photography would have looked like, will assume that this sort of antiquated technology looks magic or looks like alchemy? What are our thoughts on that? Because I think that both readings you can pull out of there. Certainly, what he's then talking about with Webb would obviously change, but I think that there's elements of both in what you're really being asked to envision or what Pynchon is depicting.
I mean, I think the conversation between him and Webb kind of encompasses both, where they do talk about the different, I forget exactly, like the fulminates, the different types of metals and how whenever you add certain chemicals, they become explosive or poisonous, which isn't, it's like they call it the anti-stone or whatever, which is like kind of the opposite of alchemy, where instead of turning mercury or some non-precious metal into a precious metal, you're turning a precious metal into some type of like destructive weapon, perhaps, or something that's dangerous and can't be used as currency, which is not something that if I heard a discussion of that, I wouldn't immediately think of alchemy, but like it is reminiscent of alchemy once you think about it, turning kind of semi-magically or seemingly magically, turning one element or metal into something else.
I take it in that specific context of just that paragraph of being a comment on the bilocality of these things, right?
Hmm.
The purpose of these chemicals, the purpose of this labware with which to handle and mix the chemicals is dependent upon what your intentions are. Going back to the photography analogy, back when it's all wet plates, no one's gonna use a camera to do private investigators' work. But as soon as you can do quick exposure on celluloid, then the Pinkertons start buying a lot of cameras,
Mm-hmm.
which when that nitrocellulose could also be used to blow up a bank. I guess to use a random example. It would be a bad one, but a firebomb or something. This is either just innocent hobby photographer or an alchemist, just from the materials you don't know.
Yeah, true enough. I think it's both. I guess that's sort of the takeaway that I make as well, Will, is that it's this concept that, like, maybe he did get involved in alchemy as a result of his interest in chemicals to be used for photography and photo processing. He certainly has both in that shed, most likely. And I think it also speaks to the idea that, yeah, if you are one of the local youths or utes, I suppose it could be said, you're going to look at a lot of this stuff and think to yourself that it is magic, or that it is something inherently alchemical looking, even if it is just innocent photography equipment. I think it is sort of some of that, like, looking back that we do to an age where technology was more esoteric or was more complicated in a certain way as far as to get a result that we would look for in the modern era, and seeing that it does look somewhat magic, like we were saying, where it seems that these things are changed almost out of nowhere, just because we don't have as efficient of technology in that time. We don't have as efficient of an understanding of how science works. I think it's a very clever thing that Pynchon is doing in this last couple of pages. This does lead us to the introduction of Webb Traverse, which, as sort of a fun aside, would appear to be the what is that, great 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 grandfather of Prairie? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 generations. There's a chart that you can look up in the Pynchon wiki that shows the whole family tree using information from both Against the Day and Vineland, which has already come up a couple times in this book, with characters being related to characters in later books, from a chronological perspective of the years that it's covering. The two of them have a very involved conversation. I've been thinking over the course of the day how best to break down the conversation between the two of them, because it isn't exactly easy to do in a simple format. I guess we could start simply, like, what do we think that they're talking about in a degree of, like, the Philosopher's Stone and the Anti-Stone? What are maybe our thoughts on the conversation they have? This was one area of the chapter that I wasn't totally sure on how the best way to actually, like, go through the material would be.
I am in agreement as to the loss of how to broach the material, but I could summarize it as Pynchon giving a step-by-step guide on how to have coded conversations.
Yeah, it certainly reads as two people kind of giving each other like a Masonic verbal handshake, certainly in the beginning, especially, where they're trying to sort of reveal to one another that they're of the same tradition or that they're of the same kind of worldview or ilk or whatever. That's for sure. But that gives way to this like, again, this conversation of the Philosopher's Stone, and then again the Anti-Stone, which is the word that they give it other than the word that it actually is called, apparently, which you can't speak out loud. I guess I should just ask right away, as the person on the show who has not read this book, does this come back up later? Would it be better to couch that, or like wait until that shows up at a later point in the book?
I don't believe it does. I definitely could be wrong. And maybe Will knows, but I believe that it doesn't really come up again. At least specifically the anti-stone concept. I honestly forget if alchemy comes up again at all, considering that this is kind of the time period whenever. I mean, I guess alchemy would have already. I guess maybe it's even discussed. Is it discussed in the section that alchemy kind of went away with the advent of capitalism?
Yeah, that's one of the things that Travers says.
Yeah. So this is already kind of late in the game for alchemy to even be a thing to be discussed, a thing to be taken seriously. So, I mean, definitely could come up later. I just don't remember it. I mean, it's 1,100 pages, but I don't believe it comes up.
Yeah, like parts of this conversation definitely do reappear, but that what we're trying to get at right doesn't, except thematically. Like the line where Merle is talking about philosophic Mercury, the line where it says, though many say it's really more of a figure of speech, like the famous philosopher's stone, supposed to really mean God or the secret of happiness or or union with the all, so forth. Chinese talk. But in fact, these things, they've been out there all along, real material things, just not easy to get to. The thing about alchemists is that, like, historical reality is that there's basically a split between the people who just wanted to turn lead into gold and people who thought that they were finding the way into, like, the Gnostic idea of salvation, or the idea of finding the map to be one with God. And so, like, alchemical texts are like, there's a weird mix of real, like, proto-chemistry and pure metaphorical work about, like, soul transformation.
Mm-hmm.
So it's one of those things where, like, it definitely comes up later, but I don't think in the alchemical terms.
So I guess do we have, and maybe what you've already kind of elucidated there, Will, is your sort of interpretation of what these two things. But do we have any particular interpretations come to mind of what the Philosopher's Stone or the Anti-Stone may represent as far as what they're talking about? Because obviously a lot of this stuff is, to your point, Will, it's signs and countersigns and watchwords and all of this stuff that they're giving each other back and forth, and including the kind of one line that Daly throws out there. But is there a larger thematic or philosophic idea that Pynchon is trying to get at with these two things? There's a lot of different, like, theories put out there on the Pynchon wiki. I didn't find any of them particularly convincing. So this could be a case where, again, just the lack of kind of scholarly work around this book is leading to a lapse, or do we have any specific ideas or theories for it?
I mean, it does, this book does have a lot of stuff to do with opposites, day versus night, good versus evil. And obviously the Philosopher's Stone and the Anti-Stone would be opposites. And, there's other examples of, Blinky Morgan's eyes are two different colors, so they'd be opposite colors. There's a lot of, I can think of other examples from stuff we've already read in this book of opposites, ideas of opposites. So there's that. I mean, it plays into kind of that theme that runs through the book. I'm not sure if it's really meant to, I don't necessarily know what they would represent, like, metaphorically or anything. I do find it interesting that the prolonged discussion of basically, like, turning silver into an explosive, explosives and especially dynamite come up a lot later. Where I believe there's a character. I think that may be a bit of a spoiler, but I won't get specific. There's the character who goes around throwing dynamite bombs at people. Kind of the authorities would use the word terrorists or a terroristic way, and I do think that the effect of the invention of dynamite on America and on the world is kind of a minor theme in this book, but it does come up later on a good amount.
Yeah, the one detail that the Pinch on Wiki did bring up that does seem helpful, especially within context of this, what I kind of started this section discussing, from the idea of like perhaps alchemy is just becoming kind of a byword for foregone technology and how that looks sort of magical to some people, is it does mention antistone might be thought of as the infernal stone, which is an alkali hydroxide, such as sodium hydroxide, caustic soda, which is used to make soap or potassium hydroxide, aka potash. They are both alkali salts. Another alkali salt, but not a hydroxide, is calcium carbonate, better known as Iceland spar, which of course is the name of this particular section. And then, like you had mentioned, Luke, if you overlay that on a photo, it doubles something. But that, of course, doesn't give you any idea of what the other thing may represent, right? The Philosopher's Stone. So again, this is potentially another instance where, like, if you as the listeners have any thoughts, or if you have any theories on what this could be, certainly email us or reach out to us on one of our social media inboxes and let us know what you think. Because, yeah, I think, I could be wrong, but I think all three of us are kind of at a loss here, right?
So I'm not at a loss. I'm at a loss for words.
Okay.
Like I'm definitely not confident. So definitely, if listeners, if you feel you have a strong concept of what this is referring to, please write in. Happy to hear it. The way I read it is there's a few angles to go at it. There's the basic baseline level of, like, okay, if we're talking about the inverse of the Philosopher's Stone, what is the opposite of a philosopher? And that's how you get the infernal stone kind of thing. And there's also the fact they call it the anti-stone. And so what is the inverse of stone rather than the inverse of the philosopher aspect? And that ties into kind of the way that Merle describes the philosophic Mercury as the you strip out the shine, the liquid metal, the greasy feel, the weight. You take away any of the material aspects of the Mercury, and what you're left with is just the concept of what that Mercury may or may not be, which I think actually lends credence to some degree of the atomic bomb interpretation, because obviously these characters are not talking about a nuclear missile device. That, as is pointed out rightfully, that nobody was thinking about elements in that way. But it at the same time, if you are talking about stripping away the essential aspects of an element, what you're left with is literally the strong and weak nuclear force, which are the underlying causes of nuclear fission as a phenomenon.
Mhm.
But then and that lines up with it doesn't line up directly, but the reason I gave so much of that context around the historic ambiguity of alchemical texts is that one of the theories that I think is fairly well attested of people talking about alchemical texts today is the theory that the reason that people couched all of these spiritual ideas in such deep coding is that it was the time when the church was the most powerful entity in the world, that they were heretics. If they spoke plainly about their search for Hermes Trismegistus, they would be killed, and no one would stand up for them. So if you're going to talk about it anyway, you have to put it in code. And given the political context of all of this conversation and the previous discussion of anarchism as something which you shouldn't even talk about, I think there is a very simple way of saying that the end of Webb's sentence of almost makes you think if there's a philosopher's stone, there might not also be an anarchist stone, which is, you're going through loops to get there. But I think that makes some sense, especially with his intentions, but also with the aspect of taking these precious metals and taking away the preciousness of them. That is in at least kind of the way that this book comes at anarchism as a philosophy, or as at least a specific political opinion. It is to disimbue the value of these metals. So the Philosopher's Stone puts the value in the metals. It says this is a precious thing because of this and that and all of these contexts. And the Anarchist Stone would be, here is why none of these are valuable at all. Instead of, you put lead and the Philosopher's Stone in a pot, you get gold. You put gold and anarchist in a pot and you get lead. You get inert nothingness. You get material world with no value. Not necessarily saying that Pynchon is saying that anarchism is a nihilistic philosophy, but that the imbued value of precious metals is something that is constructed through commerce in an anarchist lens. And so you take away the hierarchy and you take away that value.
Yeah, I mean that's better than anything that I can possibly think of. I see the track you're following too, for sure.
But as I hope everyone noticed, that is not a there's not a single line with this beginning, middle, and end. So it's clearly not a fully digested set of ideas.
Right. From there, we get a mention of the fact that up at Little Hellkite, their current amalgamator has gone crazy. What amalgamator work is you extract silver from its ore by combining it with mercury, is essentially what it is. So mercury fumes are toxic enough that it will drive you crazy. And this amalgamator has called himself the president, and he's got someone following him around playing Hail to the Chief out of tune. He declared war on Colorado last week, and it would appear as though he is well on his way out as soon as the company can replace him. This is out in Telluride, Colorado. And then this is where we get the lines that Luke had mentioned, where it says the two men looked at each other, each pretty sure who the other was. Mine engineers take a dim view, Merle pretended to explain. Old-time superstition from back in the Dark Ages. Nowhere near as scientific as modern-day metallurgy. He paused as if to catch his breath. But if you look at history, modern chemistry only starts coming in to replace alchemy around the same time capitalism really gets going. Strange, huh? What do you make of that? Webb nodded agreeably. Maybe capitalism decided it didn't need the old magic anymore, an emphasis whose contempt was not meant to escape Merle's attention. Why bother? Had their own magic, doing just fine, thanks. Instead of turning lead into gold, they could take poor people's sweat and turn it into greenbacks, and save that lead for enforcement purposes. And the gold and silver? More of a curse than they know, maybe. Sitting right there in the vault, just waiting for... Don't say it! This is, again, talking about this idea of sort of the passage of time leading to less of these things that we kind of denote as magic, or that do have this kind of potentially imbued sacred or special nature to it. That idea of, again, invention or explaining or modernity or whatever word you want to apply, marching forward as a result of that capitalistic engine does kill the inherent magic in a lot of these things. But it is still an equation of some kind. Just that instead of turning one thing into another, is what alchemy is. It's turning, sweat into money, which is its own sort of alchemy as a result. Just another great sort of illustration of the themes that Pynchon is working with, just not only in this chapter, but as a whole in this book so far. It's something that I probably more than any other theme so far in the book am looking forward to the kind of expansion of and further elucidation of that concept. From there, Webb mentions a item here called Coxey's Army or Coxey's Army, I'm not sure how it's pronounced. This is another allusion to real history. In the year of 1894, so in that depression that we had talked about a little bit earlier in the episode, a group of unemployed men basically went on a giant caravan march down to Washington, D.C. They were hoping to persuade Congress to get a bunch of public works programs initiated that could give them jobs for people who were out of work, which should sound familiar because that is basically what the New Deal was. to get out of the Great Depression. It was a series of public works jobs that employed thousands upon thousands of people and restarted the economy. This particular caravan did leave Ohio as well, so it does bring up again that location that we started out in, and ended up being about 500 people that actually got to Washington about 2 months later almost, and didn't accomplish anything. There's a lot of like news about it, articles written about it, but no actual legislation was passed. And then we figure out that that the president, so to speak, has been replaced by Merle Rideout. He is now doing amalgam work at the mine. And then we close out this chapter and our reading with the lines here. Lately, Merle had been visited by a strange feeling that photography and alchemy were just two ways of getting at the same thing, redeeming light from the inertia of precious metals. And maybe his and Dally's long road out here was not the result of any idle drift, but more of a secret imperative, like the force of gravity from all the silver he'd been developing out in the pictures he'd been taking over all those years. As if silver were alive, with a soul and a voice, and he'd been working for it as much as for him. And that closes out our chapter. Do we have any additional thoughts before we start to wind down?
I guess just, is there a full understanding of the interjection that Dally puts into the middle of the conversation between Merle and Webb?
And if a nightshirt for an elephant cost 2 cents, we couldn't put a baby bonnet for a pissant? That one?
Yeah.
Not that I know of. I think that that's just supposed to me anyway, that reads as so specifically coded, like as a handshake phrase, that it's meant to clue the reader in what Merle and Webb are doing if they haven't picked up on it. That's my understanding.
Yeah, I mean, I think there, on one level, it might be that. On another, it might just be like one of those joke riddles that was popular in this time, like why is a mouse when it spins or something? And it's just like a pun of like, we're poor because an elephant's nightshirt costs 2 cents and we can't even afford a piss ant as a, just pun on elephant.
Mm-hmm.
Can't even afford an ant's baby bonnet. But like yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I couldn't come with any specific like reason or phrase or anything like that. Are there any funny moments that we didn't go over as we went through this chapter?
Everything about the light addicts I thought was pretty funny. There's a bunch of really fun examples of, there were light addicts who on Sunset began to sweat and itch, seclude themselves in toilets with portable electric lanterns. Just that whole paragraph from the end of 59 on to 60 was full of some really funny stuff. Maybe not laugh out loud funny, but it's just kind of, it'll put a smile on your face, perhaps. That also, I meant to mention this kind of vaguely, but it does kind of remind me a little bit of the Thanatoids in Vineland, just with the addiction aspect and the addiction to light. I mean, television is ultimately just, different colors of light or, whatever. I think you get what I'm saying there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, throughout that entire section, a lot of little jokes, like Luke said. Just the names of the gal pals of Merle's when he's in Cleveland with Madge and Mia Culpepper.
Mm-hmm.
The Pigeon Wiki pretty much covers the actual discussion of the meaning of the name. But I just think Madge Culpepper and Mia Culpepper from like a Midwest accent, just a fun what is the word? Just wordplay, I guess. What we settled on many episodes ago.
Yeah. True enough. Do we have a most pinch on part of the chapter?
Mine is probably the sentient ball lightning, which I did liken to Byron the Bulb early on. Which is there's actually one other part of this section that kind of reminds me of Byron the Bulb. But even the inclusion of ball lightning at all is a little bit more than a little bit Pinchonian in terms of it's kind of not a super well known aspect of electricity and lightning. It's a little bit more niche. Not it's not you mentioned ball lightning to somebody, like a lay person. It's not, they might know what it is, but they might not. It's not for sure that they would know what it is. And making it sentient is a very Pinchonian thing to do.
Yeah. I think for me, it's like the ball lightning does stand out, certainly. Like I would probably say that is that aside. It's probably the most Pinchonian part of it. To offer a second option, I would say that all of the mixture between alchemy and old processing methods for wet plate photography also seems very Pinchonian. The degree to research that it's obvious he did, and then the kind of mixture of magic with the reality of it being related to this old technology feels particularly on brand for him, especially with that essay that he would eventually publish or had published at this point. The It's Okay to Be a Luddite essay. A lot of that I think deals with this idea of there was a time when these things could have been good, or were a time when these things had kind of advanced far enough and we didn't need to go beyond them. That'll seems very distinctly something that only he would choose to work over thematically in a book that he was writing.
Yeah, I was trying to decide whether to go with that facet or just to zoom in on the first paragraph of the chapter that you actually started our conversation with, because it to me it reads as just kind of like an in the text justification and explanation of the, I think, what has started to be like in published articles called the Pynchon list. Just you list specific details about the environment to characterize somebody, and for that to be there, and then to have the explanation of he woke up understanding at once that the whole purpose of this dream was to remind him with diabolical roundaboutness of Erlis Mills, as though anyone in the world would read the preceding few sentences and think it had any other meaning.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it. Or a good thing to pull, rather. Who wants to go first for quote?
Claiming first, so this doesn't get stolen, because it might be my favorite paragraph in the entire book, honestly.
Okay.
The reason for that I'm going to put before reading out the quote for once. Basically, just keep in mind as I read this, the point of conversation in online literature circles of people who say things like, oh, people only ever read Thomas Pynchon for the sake of like going off on Wikipedia tangents. On page 71, they pushed out into morning fields that went rolling all the way to every horizon, the inner American Sea, where the chickens schooled like herring and the hogs and heifers foraged and browsed like groupers and codfish, and the sharks tended to operate out of Chicago or Kansas City, the farmhouses and towns rising up along the journey like islands. With girls in every one, Merle couldn't help but notice the extravagantly kept promises of island girls, found riding the electric trolley lines that linked each cozy city to each, or serenely dealing cards in the riverside saloons, slinging hash in cafeterias you walked downstairs into out of the red brick streets, gazing through door screens in Cedar Rapids, girls at fences in front of long fields in yellow light, Lizas and Justinas, girls of the plains and of profusely flowered seasons that may never quite have been, cooking for threshers far into and sometimes all through the nights of harvest, watching the streetcars come and go, dreaming of cavalry boys ridden off down the pikes, sipping the local brain tonic, tending steaming wash tubs full of corn ears at the street corners with radiant eyes ever on the move, in Ottumwa beating a rug, waiting in the mosquito-thick evenings of downstate Illinois, waiting by the fence post where the bluebirds were nesting for a footloose brother to come back home after all, looking out a window in Albert Lee as the trains went quiring by. There's no real emotional content in that other than just vague nostalgia. But it is just such a beautiful encapsulation of just kind of Americana as an idea.
Yeah, true enough.
Yeah, at least like Midwestern Americana.
Yeah. I do appreciate all of the Midwest in this chapter, as someone who's, as I've mentioned a couple times, lived there my whole life. Sometimes he treats the Midwest with comical derision. Sometimes he writes very beautifully about it, and there is a lot of the latter in these pages.
That was going to be my quote, Will, so good job.
I'm glad for the second time I've stolen the quote.
My quote is on page 75. after Merle finds the magazine with Erlis on it. It says, he stood there in the corner of an alleyway, just out of a wind meaner than any he could remember since Chicago, full of ice crystals and hostile intent, and imagined it was telling him to wake up. He had no illusions about what could be done in the darkroom to enhance a human image, but Erlis, who had always been beautiful, was way beyond all of that now. Years of bitterness about how little she had loved him sloughed away, and Merle understood, miles down the line, the simple truth that Erlis had no more been his than the unfortunate Bert Sindell's, and that to persist in that belief anymore was to approach the gates of the Laughing Academy. You know, I've talked a lot over the recording of this episode how there are, like, and the three of us have talked about it as well, that there's a lot of emotional, relational stuff in this chapter that is very relatable. And that even if it's something that maybe you don't have direct experience with, you know, from a parental aspect or whatever it may be, that there's still some degree of relatability within it. And this is one of those ones where, like Luke had talked about having some feelings of relatability with one of the earlier portions, that I have a lot of relatability with. This idea that, like, suddenly at some point, potentially months or years later after a relationship is over, you have this moment of realization that is just so random at times, but also affecting, that, like, that relationship sucked, or that person maybe was abusive, or that person was just bad for you, or something you understood in that relationship wasn't actually real or wasn't reality. And the way that that is depicted here is just so perfectly encapsulated and done. That idea of first comparing it to something he knows for sure, this idea of what you can do in a dark room, like he knows that cold, and then transitioning that to something he doesn't know, but that is, you know, mixed with it in this photo of this woman that he thought he understood, but that he didn't, and then that usage of the cold, bitter wind trying to wake him up, you know, wake him up to the reality of what the situation was. I think it's just really just beautifully done, and it's one of these small character moments that, you know, the first time I read through these pages, I didn't even really notice it, to be honest with you. And then going back over the pages in preparation for the podcast, like it really hit me at that point. And it's absolutely excellent.
I really like what you said in the quote. So my quote's from page 70, which we've already went over how beautiful this is, but sometimes she was overwhelmed by the green life passing in such high turbulence, too much to see, all clamoring to have its way. Leaves sawtooth, spade-shaped, long and thin, blunt-fingered, downy and veined, oiled and dusty with the day. Flowers and bells and clusters, purple and white or yellow as butter, star-shaped ferns in the wet and dark places, millions of green veilings before the bridal secrets in the moss and under the deadfalls. Went on by the wheels, creaking and struck by rocks in the ruts, sparks visible only to its shadow it might pass over. A busy development of small trailside shapes tumbling in what had to be deliberately arranged precision. Herbs the wild crafters knew the names and market prices of, and which the silent women up in the foothills, counterparts whom they most often never got even to meet, knew the magic uses for. They lived for different futures, but they were each other's unrecognized halves, and what fascination between them did not come to pass was lit up, beyond question, with grace. I mean that you know, the prose there is obviously really beautiful and evocative. I do kind of wonder what that last sentence necessarily means and who it's referring to. It could be referring to Merle and Dally, or I don't know. But ending the paragraph on grace does kind of presage some parts at the end of the book. I'll say, maybe I don't want to spoil anything. And yeah, it's just really beautiful. Finch's nature writing, that aspect of his work is definitely under discussed in general, in my opinion. And yeah, it does kind of remind me a little bit of the quote that Kate read out for her bonus episode on the Pale King, the opening section of the Pale King, where it's a long, even longer than that paragraph, a long kind of rant. Rant's not the right word, but a long stream of consciousness paragraph, or, you know, piece of writing that's very focused on nature and kind of the details of nature, that you can kind of, you know, when you're driving by a really beautiful field or something, like, not everyone is going to notice how beautiful it is. You know, it's kind of I don't know. There's an aspect of the American landscape that I feel like that captures the beauty of the American landscape. That I feel like that captures the details of. I feel like not everyone notices. So
Yeah, agreed. And that's a good comparison of that opening passage from the Pale King. I don't know if I necessarily would have made that comparison directly, but they are both similar, and they're also both describing an area of the Midwest as well.
yeah.
We did get some correspondence over the past couple of weeks. Does one of you guys want to read out that review that someone left on iTunes?
So I believe this review is from Doc DeNoon. DeNoon. The tone of the discussion is low-key and inviting, so much so that you might miss how really thoughtful the hosts are. If you already love Pynchon or are just curious, this is an absolute recommendation. This team has a fresh, open perspective and bring out the heart and the fun that many critics overlook. Cheers. I can't speak for Will, but I know Cody and Kate were talking in our group chat about how much we appreciated, or how much they appreciated that quote or that review. I really appreciate it. I'm sure Will does. Specifically, I have been reading some Pynchon scholarship lately, and it can be annoyingly dry and annoyingly like, hey, I've read every single book ever. Let me reference, obscure 18th century books that supposedly influenced Pynchon and shit like that. And I do think that we do at least try to kind of make it more conversational while still having some depth. So we really appreciated that review.
Yeah, I can clarify that I do share those feelings. I still feel like the person who disrespected our disdain for Journey. That if we're getting into ranking our reviews now, that one's the one that touched my soul the most. But Doc, yours greatly appreciated.
Yeah, I think that the way that review sums up, I guess what we all try to do here is pretty perfect. So thank you for leaving that. We did also get one email over the course of this week, which I'll read now. Hey, I'm a fan of your guys' work and have been listening since Vineland. I just started Against the Day myself, having finished part 1 today. After listening to the first 2 ATD episodes, there were a few comments I wanted to make. 1. In regards to the math question, chapter 2. The joke about Riemann is a bit weird. I used to have a comment on the Spotify page for the episode, but the character limit resulted in a very poorly worded analysis. This first comment is, hopefully, a better attempt to interpret it. This is my first go at this book, so I don't know how the Riemann hypothesis Riemann zeta function comes up later. However, I'd say this specific joke has less to do with that and more with manifolds. Riemann worked on several things, topology being one of them. Basically, a manifold is some surface which looks flat, or Euclidean up close, so you can define a set of maps which chart small regions of the manifold to Euclidean space. You could think of the Earth as a manifold, since it looks two-dimensionally flat or Euclidean up close. There's problems with projecting the entire manifold to Euclidean space, though, i.e. why the Mercator projection makes Greenland huge. Similarly, humans are kind of manifold, so my best guess at the joke is that the chums of chance think that properly punishing Miles via covering or charting him would be too hard to figure out. We aren't as simple as a sphere. 2. In the same vein, I find the setting interesting from the perspective of someone with a math or physics background. The turn of the century lies in the space between the development of modern math and the advent of modern physics. The 1800s essentially saw the rise of modern mathematics through the fields such as abstract algebra, linear algebra, differential geometry, and so on. There were developments in physics too, namely classical electrodynamics, which make up much of the chapters of 7 and 9. However, this is not considered part of the modern physics breakthroughs of the 1900s to 1940s, like quantum mechanics and general relativity. Merle being present at the Michelson-Morley experiment is an interesting way to express this divide, as classical electrodynamics was developed in the era of the luminiferous ether. Given the book's themes of light, I'm interested to see if Pynchon tackles QM, statistical linear algebra, which studies subatomic particles like electrons and photons. The theme of duality meshes perfectly with wave-particle duality. 3. I wanted to make a small, kind of conspiratorial remark on Lou. Alright, we got our first listener conspiracy corner. Given the connection you guys make to the Pynchon stand-in, and the fact that he works at White City Investigation, maybe an allusion to the White Visitation, I feel Pynchon had a similar ethos writing him as he did Slothrop. Of course, I may be completely off base given my lack of knowledge on Iceland Spar and beyond. Running with the theory that he didn't exist before the horrible thing he committed leading him to eventually work for a shady organization, I can't help but think of him as a reverse Slothrop. I could be totally off, though. Sorry for the massive email. I appreciate you guys taking the time to read this and look forward to your future episodes. Thanks.
I really like that comment, especially about the reverse Slothrop. I actually, as I've mentioned before, I've been slowly working my way back through Gravity Rainbow for the third time. And I just read the part where Slothrop at least begins to dissolve or begins to kind of become not physical, become more of like a metaphysical entity or a ghost. And Lou definitely could, instead of dissolving, he would do the opposite, which is like appearing or coalescing or appearing. He just so I really like that comment. As for the rest of it, I can't really speak to it because I have little to no knowledge of physics and the details of mathematics.
Yeah, I concur. I really appreciate the idea of the inversion of Slothrop and Lou. I do just want to clarify. I wasn't necessarily saying that I think Lou didn't exist. I guess I was trying to say that I think that is kind of a fourth wall break of saying this is just a character. But yeah, to your previous comments, I will say that I am not a math or physics expert, but I know a little bit more than the average bear. I promise more manifold stuff will come up.
Yeah, certainly echo the same comments on Slothrop. That's a really great call out. In the grand, I guess, sort of experience of Conspiracy Corner ideas not being that crazy, you have certainly done the same thing that we all tend to do. That makes a lot of sense. And then with the other stuff as it relates to manifold and to physics and mathematics, I hope that the stuff you're talking about there ends up being exactly what sort of unfolds over the course of the book. Sounds like some of it certainly will, but as someone who hasn't read the whole book, I don't know yet. But yeah, I'm excited for the direction that it's taking, and it seems like certainly those ideas of like refraction or duality or manifolds and things like that is a part of the big kind of web of ideas that he's working with and putting together chapter after chapter.
I did want to add that, Pynchon, I think, started college as, I believe, an engineering major. It had something to do with math and physics, though. He switched to English, I think, halfway after his time in the Navy, about halfway through. But a little biographical tidbit about Pynchon is that we do know that he applied, I think it was after V came out. V had definitely been written at this point, but he applied to go to grad school at UC Berkeley for mathematics, and his application was denied for some reason that we don't know. It could just be that he was an English major, didn't have the required, prerequisites and stuff. All that to say, math is pretty obviously a pretty big obsession of Pynchon's. It comes up some in his other work. Usually that kind of stuff goes over my head, so I can't really be too specific, but math is definitely pretty big interest of Pynchon's, so.
Yeah, that's also a good point. I forgot about that. I wonder what would have changed if he had been accepted at UC Berkeley.
Yeah, it's unclear if why he applied at all. I don't, because I'm not necessarily this way. We're I got an MFA just kind of for fun, and I knew it wouldn't really help my job prospects.
Mm-hmm.
But it does kind of beg the question of what was his end game with applying to grad school for math, and if he was wanting to go away from writing and publishing, or what exactly was the point of that grad school application. So
all I can say there is that I've been considering going back to get my bachelor's finally, and I've been considering math. So I can empathize with Pynchon there. I'd completely forgotten that he applied for a grad placement at Berkeley for that, though. It's there. The people talking about how math is the language of the universe, man, are not just physicists or mathematicians who smoke too much weed.
All right, that is all for our correspondence for this episode. Next week, we are going to be not next week anymore. We don't release these weekly anymore. Still getting used to that. For the next episode, we are going to be reading through pages 81 to 96 if you are someone, again, with a different pagination, you should read to the end of the chapter that finishes with the line, Veikko is pouring vodka, happy 4th of July, Webb. That is where we'll be ending up with the next chapter. And as always, if you have any thoughts on either the stuff that we talked about in this episode that we invited you to email us about, or anything, you can absolutely do so. We can be reached at mappingthezonepod@gmail.com. We are also on Twitter at mappingthezonepod. We are on Instagram at mappingthezonepodcast. We are also on Blue Sky under, I want to say it's Pinch on Pod. Because, yeah, our Twitter is not Mapping the Zone Pod. Our Twitter is Pinch on Pod. And I believe our Blue Sky is exactly the same. Cody's not here to verify that.
It's Mapping the Zone, bsky.social.
Okay, so that is where we can be reached on Blue Sky if you happen to be over there. And, yeah, please keep the engagement coming. We're all having a great time with this season. It seems like everybody from the listener side is enjoying it as well. So we'll keep doing it. Yeah, until next time, thanks for listening.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye!